In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. The Mayor's Parlour. Hathelsborough Market Place lies in the middle of the town, a long, somewhat narrow parallelogram, enclosed on its longer side by old gabled houses, shut in on its western end by the massive bulk of the great parish church of St. Hathelswood, Virgin and Martyr, and at its eastern by the ancient walls and high roofs of its mediaeval Moot Hall. The inner surface of this space is paved with cobblestones, worn smooth by centuries of usage. It is only of late years that the conservative spirit of the old borough has so far accommodated itself to modern requirements as to provide footpaths in front of the shops and houses. But there that same spirit has stopped. The utilitarian of today would sweep away, as being serious hindrances to wheeled traffic, the two picturesque 15th century erections which stand in this market place, these High Cross and Low Cross, one at the east end, in front of the Moot Hall, the other at the west, facing the chancel of the church, remain, to the delight of the archaeologist, as instances of the fashion in which our forefathers built gathering places in the very midst of narrow thoroughfares. Under the graceful cupola and the flying buttresses of High Cross, the country folk still expose for sale on market days their butter and their eggs. Around the base of the slender shaft called Low Cross they still offer their poultry and rabbits. On other than market days, High Cross and Low Cross alike make central open-air clubs for the patriarchs of the place, who there assemble in the lazy afternoons and still lazier eventides to gossip over the latest items of local news, conscious that as they are doing so their ancestors have done for many a generation, and that, old as they may be themselves, in their septuagenarian or octogenarian states, they are as infants in comparison with the age of the stones and bricks and timbers about them, grey and fragrant with the antiquity of at least 300 years. Of all this mass of venerable material, still sound and uncrumbled, the great tall towered church at one end of the market place, and the square, heavily fashioned Moot Hall at the other, go farthest back, through association, into the mists of the Middle Ages. The church dates from the 13th century, and though it has been skilfully restored on more than one occasion, there is nothing in its cathedral-like proportions that suggests modernity. The Moot Hall, erected 100 years later, remains precisely as when it was first fashioned, and though it too has passed under the hand of the restorer, its renovation has only taken the shape of strengthening an already formidably strong building. Extending across nearly the whole eastern end of the market place, and flanked on one side by an ancient dwelling house, once the official residence of the mayors of Hathelsborough, and on the other by a more modern but still old-world building, long used as a bank, Hathelsborough Moot Hall presents the appearance of a mediaeval fortress, as though its original builders had meant it to be a possible refuge for the townsfolk against masterful baron or marauding Scot. From the market place itself there is but one entrance to it, an arched doorway opening upon a low-roofed stone hall. In place of a door there are heavy gates of iron, with a smaller wicket gate set in their midst. From the stone hall a stone stair leads to the various chambers above. In the outer walls the windows are high and narrow, each is filled with old painted glass. A strong, grim building this, and when the iron gates are locked, as they are every night when the curfew bell, an ancient institution jealously kept up in Hathelsborough, rings from St. Hathelswood's tower, a man might safely wager his all to nothing that only modern artillery could effect an entrance to its dark and gloomy interior. On a certain April evening, the time being within an hour of curfew, which, to be exact, is rung in Hathelsborough every night, all the year round, 60 minutes after sunset, despite the fact that it is nowadays but a meaningless if time-honoured ceremony, Bunning, caretaker and custodian of the Moot Hall, stood without its gates, smoking his pipe and looking around him. He was an ex-army man, Bunning, who had seen service in many parts of the world, and was frequently heard to declare that although he had set eyes on many men and many cities, he had never found the equal of Hathelsborough folk, nor seen a fairer prospect than that on which he now gazed. The truth was that Bunning was a Hathelsborough man, and having wandered about a good deal during his military service, from Aldershot to Gibraltar, and Gibraltar to Malta, and Malta to Cairo, and Cairo to Peshawar, was well content to settle down in a comfortable berth amidst the familiar scenes of his childhood. But anyone who loves the ancient country towns of England would have agreed with Bunning that Hathelsborough market place made an unusually attractive picture on a spring evening. There were the old gabled houses, quaintly roofed and timbered; there the lace-like masonry of High Cross; there the slender proportions of Low Cross; there the mighty bulk of the great church, built over the very spot whereon the virgin saint suffered martyrdom; there, towering above the gables on the north side, the well-preserved masonry of the massive Norman keep of Hathelsborough Castle; there a score of places and signs with which Bunning had kept up a close acquaintance in youth, and borne in mind when far away under other skies; and around the church tower and at the base of the tall keep were the elms for which the town was famous, mighty giants of the tree world, just now bursting into leaf, and above them the rooks and jackdaws circling and calling above the hum and murmur of the town. To Bunning's right and left, going away from the eastern corner of the market place, lay two narrow streets, called respectively Rivergate and Meadowgate. One led downwards to the little river on the southern edge of the town, the other ran towards the wide-spread grasslands that stretched on its northern boundary. And as he stood looking about him, he saw a man turn the corner of Meadowgate, a man who came hurrying along in his direction, walking sharply, his eyes bent on the flags beneath his feet, his whole attitude that of one in deep reflection. At sight of him, Bunning put his pipe in his pocket, gave himself the soldier's shake, and as the man drew near, stood smartly to attention. The man looked up; Bunning's right hand went up to his cap in the old familiar fashion. That was how, for many a long year of service, he had saluted his superiors. There was nothing very awe-compelling about the person whom the caretaker thus greeted with so much punctilious ceremony. He was a little, somewhat insignificant-looking man, at first sight. His clothes were well worn and carelessly put on; the collar of his undercoat projected high above that of his overcoat; his necktie had slipped round towards one ear; his linen was frayed; his felt hat, worn anyway, needed brushing; he wore cotton gloves too big for him; he carried a mass of papers and books under one arm; the other hand grasped an umbrella which had grown green and grey in service. He might have been all sorts of insignificant things, the clerk going homeward from his work, a tax gatherer carrying his documents, a rent collector anxious about a defaulting tenant, anything of that sort. But Bunning knew him for Mr. Councillor John Wallingford, at that time Mayor of Hathelsborough. He knew something else, too, that Wallingford, in spite of his careless attire and very ordinary appearance, was a remarkable man. He was not a native of the old town, although he was, for 12 months at any rate, its first magistrate, and consequently the most important person in the place. Hathelsborough folk still ranked him as a stranger, for he had only been amongst them for some 12 years. But during that time he had made his mark in the town; coming there as managing clerk to a firm of solicitors, he had ultimately succeeded to the practice which he had formerly managed for its two elderly partners, now retired. At an early period of his Hathelsborough career he had taken keen and deep interest in the municipal affairs of his adopted town, and had succeeded in getting a seat on the council, where he had quickly made his influence felt; and in the previous November he had been elected, by a majority of 1 vote, to the mayoralty, and had so become the 481st burgess of the ancient borough to wear the furred mantle and gold chain which symbolised his dignity. He looked very different in these grandeurs to what he did in his everyday attire, but whether in the mayoral robes or in his carelessly worn clothes, any close observer would have seen that Wallingford was a sharp, shrewd man, with all his wits about him, a close-seeing, concentrated man, likely to go through, no matter what obstacles rose in his path, with anything that he took in hand. Bunning was becoming accustomed to these evening visits of the Mayor to the Moot Hall. Of late Wallingford had come there often, going upstairs to the Mayor's parlour, and remaining there alone until 10 or 11 o'clock. Always he brought books and papers with him. Always, as he entered, he gave the custodian the same command: no one was to disturb him on any pretext whatever. But on this occasion Bunning heard a different order. "Oh, Bunning," said the Mayor, as he came up to the iron gates before which the ex-sergeant major stood, still at attention, "I shall be in the Mayor's parlour for some time to night, and I'm not to be disturbed, as usual. Except, however, for this. I'm expecting my cousin, Mr. Brent, from London this evening, and I left word at my rooms that if he came any time before 10 he was to be sent on here. So if he comes, show him up to me. But nobody else, Bunning." "Very good, your Worship," replied Bunning. "I'll see to it. Mr. Brent, from London." "You've seen him before," said the Mayor. "He was here last Christmas. Tall young fellow, clean-shaven. You'll know him." He hurried inside the stone hall, and went away by the stairs to the upper regions of the gloomy old place, and Bunning, with another salute, turned from him, pulled out his pipe, and began to smoke again. He was never tired of looking out on that old market-place. Even in the quietest hours of the evening there was always something going on, something to be seen, trivial things, no doubt, but full of interest to Bunning: folks coming and going, young people sweethearting, acquaintances passing and repassing. These things were of more importance to his essentially parochial mind than affairs of state. Presently came along another Corporation official whom Bunning knew as well as he knew the Mayor, an official who, indeed, was known all over the town, and familiar to everybody from the mere fact that he was always attired in a livery the like of which he and his predecessors had been wearing for at least 200 years. This was Spizey, a consequential person who, in the borough rolls for the time being, was entered as bellman, town crier, and mace bearer. Spizey was a big fleshy man, with a large solemn face, a ponderous manner, and small eyes. His ample figure was habited at all seasons of the year in a voluminous cloak which had much gold lace on its front and cuffs and many capes around the shoulders. He wore a 3-cornered laced hat on his bullet head, and carried a tall staff, not unlike a wand, in his hand. There were a few, very few, progressive folk in Hathelsborough who regarded Spizey and his semi-theatrical attire as an anachronism, and openly derided both, but so far nobody had dared to advocate the abolition of him and his livery. He was part and parcel of the high tradition, a reminder of the fact that Hathelsborough possessed a charter of incorporation centuries before its now more popular and important neighbouring boroughs gained theirs, and in his own opinion the discontinuance of his symbols of office would have been little less serious than the sale of the Mayor's purple robe and chain of solid gold. Spizey, thus attired, was Hathelsborough, and, as he was not slow to remind awe-stricken audiences at his favourite tavern, mayors, aldermen, and councillors were, so to speak, creatures of the moment. The Mayor, for example, was His Worship for 12 months, and plain Mr. Chips the grocer ever after. But he, Spizey, was a permanent institution, and not to be moved. Spizey was on his way to his favourite tavern now, to smoke his pipe, which it was beneath his dignity to do in public, and drink his glass amongst his cronies, but he stopped to exchange the time of day with Bunning, whom he regarded with patronising condescension as being a lesser light than himself; and having remarked that this was a fine evening, after the usual fashion of British folk, who are for ever wasting time and breath in drawing each other's attention to obvious facts, he cocked up one of his small eyes at the stairs behind the iron gates. "Worship up there?" he asked, transferring his gaze to Bunning. "Just gone up," answered Bunning. "5 minutes ago." The mace bearer looked up the market place, down the river gate, and along Meadow Gate. Having assured himself that there was nobody within 50 yards, he sank his mellow voice to a melodious whisper, and poked Bunning in the ribs with a pudgy forefinger. "Ah!" he said confidingly. "Just so! Again! Now, as a Corporation official, though not, to be sure, of the long standing that I am, what do you make of it?" "Make of what?" demanded the caretaker. Spizey came still nearer to his companion. He was one of those men who, when disposed to confidential communication, have a trick of getting as close as possible to their victims and of poking and prodding them. Again he stuck his finger into Bunning's ribs. "Make of what, says you?" he breathed. "Ay, to be sure! Why, of all this coming up at night to the Moot Hall, and sitting all alone in that there Mayor's Parlour, not to be disturbed by nobody whomsoever. What's it all mean?" "No business of mine," replied Bunning, "nor of anybody's but his own. That is, so far as I'm aware of. What about it?" Spizey removed his 3-cornered hat, took a many-coloured handkerchief out of it, and wiped his forehead. He was in a state of perpetual warmth, and had a habit of mopping his brow when called on for mental effort. "Ah!" he said. "That's just it. What about it, do you say? Well, what I says is this here. 'Tain't in accordance with precedent. Precedent, mark you, which is what a ancient corporation of this sort goes by. Where should we all be if what was done by our fathers before us wasn't done by us? What has been, must be. Take me, don't I do what's been done in this here town of Hathelsborough for time immemorial? Well, then!" "That's just it," said Bunning. "Well, then? Why shouldn't his Worship come here at night and stick up there as long as he likes? What's against it?" "Precedent!" retorted Spizey. "Ain't never been done before never! Haven't I been in the office I hold nigh on to 40 years? Seen a many mayors, aldermen, and common councillors come and go in my time. But never do I remember a mayor coming here to this Moot Hall of a night, with books and papers, which is dangerous matters at any time except in their proper place, such as my proclamations and the town documents, and sitting there for hours doing what?" Bunning shook his head. He was pulling steadily at his pipe as he listened, and he gazed meditatively at the smoke curling away from it and his pipe. "Well?" he said, after a pause. "And what do you make of it? You'll have some idea, I reckon, a man of your importance." Once more the mace bearer looked round and once more applied his forefinger to Bunning's waistline. His voice grew deep with confidence. "Mischief!" he whispered. "Mischief! That's what I make of it. He's up to something what'll be dangerous to the vested interests in this here ancient borough. Ain't he allus been one of them Radicals what wants to pull down everything what's made this here country what it is? Didn't he put in his last election address, when he was candidate for the council, for the Castle Ward, that he was all for retrenchment and reform? Didn't he say, when he was elected mayor, by a majority of 1 vote, that he intended to go thoroughly into the financial affairs of the town and do away with a lot of expenses which in his opinion wasn't necessary? Oh, I've heard talk men in high office, like me, hears a great deal. Why, I've heard it said that he's been heard to say in private that it was high time to abolish me." Bunning's mouth opened a little. He was a man of simple nature, and the picture of Hathelsborough without Spizey and his livery appalled him. "Bless me!" he exclaimed. "To be sure," said Spizey. It's beyond comprehension. To abolish me! What, in a manner of speaking, has existed I don't know how long. I ain't a man. I'm an office. Who'd cry things that were lost, at that there cross? Who'd pull the big bell on great occasions, and carry round the little un when there was proclamations to be made? Who'd walk in front of the mayor's procession with the mace, what was given to this here town by King Henry the Seventh his very self? Abolish me? Why, it's as bad as talking about abolishing the Bible." "It's the age for that sort of thing," remarked Bunning. "I seen a great deal of it in the army. Abolished all sorts of things they have, there. I never seen no good come of it, neither. I'm all for keeping up the good old things can't better 'em, in my opinion. And, as you say, that there mace of ours, 'tis ancient." "Nobody but one of these here Radicals and Levellers could talk of doing away with such proper institutions," affirmed Spizey. "But I tell you, I've heard of it. He said but you'd scarce believe it there was no need for a town crier, nor a bellman, and as for this mace, it could be carried on Mayor's Day by a policeman. Fancy that, now! Our mace carried by a policeman!" "Dear, dear!" said Bunning. "Don't seem to fit in, that. However," he added consolingly, "if they did abolish you, you'd no doubt get a handsome pension." "Pension!" exclaimed Spizey. "That's a detail. It's the office I'm a considering of. What this here free and ancient borough would look like without me, I cannot think." He shook his head and went sadly away, and Bunning, suddenly remembering that it was about his supper time, prepared to retreat into the room which he and his wife shared at the end of the stone hall. But as he entered the gates, a quick, firm footstep sounded behind him, and he turned to see a smart, alert looking young man approaching. Bunning recognized him as a stranger whom he had seen once or twice before, at intervals, in company with Wallingford. For the second time that night he saluted. "Looking for the Mayor, sir?" he asked, throwing the gate open. "His Worship's upstairs. I was to show you up. Mr. Brent, isn't it, sir?" "Right," replied the other. "My cousin left word I was to join him here. Whereabouts is he in this old fortress of yours?" "This way, sir," said Bunning. "Fortress you call it, sir, but it's more like a rabbit warren. No end of twists and turns that is, once you get inside it." He preceded Richard Brent up the stone staircase, along the narrow corridors and passages, until he came to a door, at which he knocked gently. Receiving no reply, he opened it and went in, motioning Brent to follow. But before Bunning had well crossed the threshold, he started back with a sharp cry. The Mayor was there, but he was lying face forward across the desk, lifeless. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. The Cambric Handkerchief. Bunning knew the Mayor was dead before that cry of surprise had passed his lips. In his time he'd seen many dead men. Sometimes it was a bullet, sometimes a bayonet. He knew the signs of what follows on the swift passage of one and the sharp thrust of the other. In his first glance into the room he had been quick to notice the limp hand hanging across the edge of the desk, the way in which Wallingford's head lay athwart the mass of papers over which he had collapsed in falling forward from his chair. That meant death. And the old soldier's observant eye had seen more than that. Over the litter of documents which lay around the still figure were great crimson stains. The caretaker's cry changed to articulated speech. "Murder! The Mayor's been murdered!" Brent, a strongly built and active man, pushed by and made for the desk. He was going to lay a hand on his cousin's shoulder, but Bunning stopped him. "For God's sake, Mr. Brent, don't touch him!" he exclaimed. "Let him be, sir, till the police " He paused, staring round the gloomy oak panelled room, from the walls of which the portraits of various dignitaries looked down. "Who on earth can have done it?" he muttered. "It's not it's not 3/4 of an hour since he came up here." "Alone?" asked Brent. "Alone, sir! I'll take my solemn oath that nobody was here waiting for him. I'd been in this room myself not 5 minutes before he came," said Dunning. "It was empty, of course." Brent disregarded the caretaker's admonition and laid a finger on the dead man's forehead. But Bunning pointed to a dark stain, still spreading, on the back of the Mayor's coat a well worn garment of grey tweed. "Look there, sir," he whispered. "He's been run through the body from behind, right through the heart, as he sat in his chair. Murder!" "Who should murder him?" demanded Brent. Bunning made no answer. He was looking round. There were 3 doors into that room; he glanced at each, shaking his head after each glance. "We'd best get the police at once, Mr. Brent," he said. "The police station's just at the back there's a way down to it from outside this parlour. I'll run down now. You, sir?" "I'll stop here," answered Brent. "But get a doctor, will you? I want to know " "Dr. Wellesley, the police surgeon, is next door," replied Brent. "The police'll get him. But he's beyond all doctors, Mr. Brent. Instantaneous that I know." He hurried out of the room, and Brent, left alone with the dead man, looked at him once again wonderingly. Cousins though they were, he and Wallingford knew little of each other. Their acquaintance, such as it was, had not been deep enough to establish any particular affection between them. But since Wallingford's election as Mayor of Hathelsborough, Brent, by profession a journalist in London, had twice spent a week end with him in the old town, and had learned something of his plans for a reform of certain matters connected with the administration of its affairs. They had discussed these things on the occasion of his last visit, and now, as he stood by the dead man, Brent remembered certain words which Wallingford had spoken. "There are things that I can do," Wallingford had said with some confidence. And then he had added with a cynical laugh, "But there are other things that why, it would be literally as much as my life's worth to even try to undermine them." That was now 4 months since, but Brent remembered. And as he stood there, waiting for help which would be useless, he began to wonder if Wallingford, eager for reform, had attempted anything likely to bring him into personal danger. Certainly, from all that Brent knew of him, he was the sort of man who, having set himself to a task, would let nothing stop him in accomplishing it. He was the sort of man, too, Brent thought, who had a genius for making enemies. Such men always have. But murder? Cold-blooded, deliberate, apparently well-planned murder? Yet there it was before him. The Mayor of Hathelsborough had walked up into that room, sacred to his official uses, and suggestive in its atmosphere and furniture of his great dignity, and had settled down to his desk, only to be assassinated by some enemy who had taken good care to perform his crime with swiftness and thoroughness. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs outside the half-open door aroused Brent from these melancholy speculations. He turned to see Bunning coming back, attended by several men, and foremost among them Hawthwaite, superintendent of the borough police, whom Brent had met once or twice on his previous visits to the town. Hawthwaite, a big bearded man, was obviously upset, if not actually frightened. His ruddy face had paled under the caretaker's startling news, and he drew his breath sharply as he entered the Mayor's parlour and caught sight of the still figure lying across the big desk in the middle. "God bless my life and soul, Mr. Brent!" he exclaimed in hushed tones as he tiptoed nearer to the dead and the living. "What's all this? You found the Mayor dead? You and Bunning? Why " "We found him as you see him," answered Brent. "He's been murdered. There's no doubt about this, Superintendent." Hawthwaite bent down fearfully towards the dead man, and then looked round at Bunning. "When did he come up here?" he asked sharply. "About 3/4 of an hour before Mr. Brent came, sir," replied Bunning. "He came up to me as I was standing outside the gates, smoking my pipe, and said that he was going up to the Mayor's parlour, and nobody was to be allowed to disturb him, but that if his cousin, Mr. Brent, came, he was to be shown up. Mr. Brent came, and I brought him up, and we found his Worship as you see." "Somebody's been lying in wait for him," muttered Hawthwaite. "Hid in this room." "Nobody here 5 minutes before he came up, sir," affirmed Bunning. "I was up here myself. There was nobody in here, and nobody in this part of the building." Hawthwaite looked round the room, and Brent looked with him. It was a big room, panelled in old oak to half the height of its walls; above the panelling hung numerous portraits of past occupants of the mayoral chair, and some old engravings of scenes in the town. A wide, old fashioned fireplace stood to the right of the massive desk; on either side of it were recesses, in each of which there was a door. Hawthwaite stepped across to these in turn and tried them; each was locked from the inside. He silently pointed to the keys. "The door to the stairs was open, sir," remarked Bunning. "I mean, his Worship hadn't locked himself in, as I have known him to do." Hawthwaite nodded. Then he nudged Brent's elbow, looking sideways at the dead man. "Been done as he sat writing in his chair," he muttered. "Look! the pen's fallen from his fingers as he fell forward. Queer!" A policeman came hurrying into the room, pulling himself up as he saw what was there. His voice instinctively hushed. "Dr. Wellesley's just gone down Meadow Gate, sir," he announced. "They've sent for him to come here at once." "Unless " murmured the superintendent. "Still " Then the 5 or 6 men present stood, silently waiting. Some stared about the room as if wondering at his secret; some occasionally took covert glances at its central figure. One of the 3 high, narrow windows was open; Brent distinctly heard the murmur of children playing in the streets outside. And suddenly, from the tower of St. Hathelswide, at the other end of the market place, curfew began to ring. "He's coming, sir," whispered the policeman who stood near the door. "On the stairs, sir." Brent turned as Dr. Wellesley came hurrying into the room, a tall, clean shaven, fresh coloured man, who went straight to the desk, looked at what he found there, and turned quickly on the men grouped around. "How long is it since he was found?" he asked abruptly. 10 or 12 minutes," answered Brent. "Dead, then?" "Yes," said Brent. "I should say of course I don't speak professionally but I should think he'd been dead at least half an hour." The doctor glanced at the superintendent. "We must have him taken down to the mortuary," he said. "Let some of you men stay here with me, and send another for my assistant and for Dr. Barber." The superintendent gave some orders, and touching Brent's arm, motioned him to follow outside the room. "This is a bad business, Mr. Brent," he said, as they paused at the head of the stair. "That's murder, sir! But how on earth did the murderer get in there? Bunning tells me that he himself was standing outside the iron gates at the entrance to the Moot Hall from the time the Mayor entered until you came. He asserts that nobody entered the place by those gates." "I suppose there are other means of entrance?" suggested Brent. "Doubtful if anybody could get in by them at this hour of the evening," answered the superintendent. "But there are 2 ways by which anybody could get to the Mayor's Parlour. They're both what you might call complicated. I'll show you them. Come this way." He led Brent across a corridor that branched off from the head of the stone staircase, and presently stopped at a big double door. "This is the Council Chamber," he said, as they entered a spacious apartment. "You see that door in the far corner over there? There's a staircase leads down from that to the rooms that Bunning and his wife occupy as caretakers a back stairs, in fact. But nobody can come up it, and through the Council Chamber, and along the corridor to the Mayor's Parlour, without first coming through Bunning's rooms. That's flat. As for the other well, it's still more unlikely." He led Brent out of the Council Chamber and farther along to another door, which he flung open as he motioned his companion to enter. "This is the Borough Court," he said. "Magistrates' bench, solicitors' table, and all the rest of it. And there's the dock where we put the prisoners. Now, Mr. Brent, there's a staircase a corkscrew staircase, modern, of ironwork, in the corner of that dock which leads down to the cells. And that's the second way by which you could get to the Mayor's Parlour." But just fancy what that means! A man who wanted to reach the Mayor's Parlour by that means of approach would have to enter the police station from St. Lawrence Lane, at the back of the Moot Hall, pass the charge office, pass my office, go along a passage in which he'd be pretty certain to meet somebody, come up that stairs into the dock there, cross the court, and so on. That's not likely. And yet those are the only ways by which there's access to the Mayor's Parlour, except by the big staircase from the iron gates." "What is certain," observed Brent, "is that the murderer did get to the Mayor's Parlour. And what seems more important just now is the question how did he get away from it unobserved? If Bunning is certain that no one entered by the front between my cousin's arrival and my coming, he is equally certain that no one left. Is it possible that anyone left by the police station entrance?" "We'll soon settle that point," answered Hawthwaite. "Come down there." He opened the door of the dock and led Brent down an iron staircase into an arched and vaulted hall at its foot, whence they proceeded along various gloomy passages towards a heavy, iron-studded door. Near this a police constable stood writing at a tall desk. The superintendent approached him and spoke to him. Presently he turned back to Brent. "There's nobody that he doesn't know has been in or out of this place during the whole of the evening," he said. "He's been on duty there since 6 o'clock. Nobody has entered or left during the time that's elapsed." "I never supposed they had," remarked Brent. "The thing's been done in much cleverer fashion than that. As I said before, what we do know is that the murderer got to the Mayor's Parlour, and that he got away from it." Hawthwaite shook his head, with the puzzled expression overspreading his somewhat heavy and unimaginative features. "Aye, but how?" he said. "How?" "That's a job for you," replied Brent, with a suggestive glance. "And, if I might suggest it, why not make a thorough examination of the Moot Hall? My cousin showed me over it when I was here last, and I remember some queer places in it." "There are queer places in it," admitted Hawthwaite. "But it's hardly likely the murderer would hang about after doing what he did. Of course I'll have the whole place searched thoroughly every inch of it for any possible clues and traces. We shall neglect nothing in a case of this sort, I can assure you, Mr. Brent. But come into my office." He led the way into a drab walled, official looking apartment, curiously suggestive of the lesser and meaner forms of crime, and pointed to a chair. "Sit down," he said. "As I was about to say " "Oughtn't one to be doing something?" interrupted Brent, refusing the chair. "That's what I feel, anyway. Only what can one do?" "Ah, that's just it!" exclaimed Hawthwaite. "You may feel as energetic as you will, but what can you do? The doctors are doing the absolutely necessary things at present. As for me, all I can do is to search for clues and traces, as I suggested, and make all possible inquiries. But there you are we've nothing to go on nothing, I mean, that would identify." Brent gave the superintendent a keen glance. "Between ourselves," he said, "have you any reason for suspecting anyone?" Hawthwaite started. His surprise was genuine enough. "For suspecting anyone?" he exclaimed. "Good Lord, no, Mr. Brent! His Worship, poor man, wasn't exactly popular in the town with a certain section, that is but I couldn't believe that there's man or woman in the place would wish him harm. No, sir, in my opinion this is outside work." Somewhat doubtful whether any outsider could obtain the apparently very accurate knowledge of Hathelsborough Moot Hall which the murderer of my cousin evidently possessed, isn't it?" suggested Brent. "I should say the guilty person is someone who knows the place extremely well." Before the superintendent could reply, his partly open door was further opened, and a little, bustling, eager faced man, who wore large spectacles and carried a pencil behind his right ear, looked in. Brent recognized him as another of the half dozen Hathelsborough men whose acquaintance he had made on former visits Peppermore, the hard working editor reporter of the one local newspaper. Wallingford had introduced him to Peppermore in the smoking room of the Chancellor Hotel, and Peppermore, who rarely got the chance of talking to London journalists, had been loquacious and ingratiating. His expressive eyebrows, prominent features of his somewhat odd countenance, went up now as he caught sight of Brent standing on the superintendent's hearthrug. He came quickly into the room. "Mr. Brent!" he exclaimed. "No idea you were here, sir! My profound sympathy, Mr. Brent! Dear, dear, what a truly terrible affair!" Then, his professional instincts getting the better of him, he turned on Hawthwaite, at the same time pulling out a note book. "What are the details, Mr. Superintendent?" he asked. "I just met one of your officers going for Dr. Barber. He gave me the scantiest information, so I hurried to see you." "And I can't give you any more," replied Hawthwaite. "There are no details yet, my lad. All we know is that the Mayor was found dead in the Mayor's Parlour half an hour ago, and that he's been murdered. You'll have to wait for the rest." "We don't go to press till 12:30," remarked Peppermore, unperturbed by this curtness. "Perhaps by then you can give me more news, Mr. Superintendent. Murdered! The Mayor of Hathelsborough? Now, that's something unique in the history of the town, I believe. I was looking over the records not so long ago, and I don't remember coming across any entry of such an event as this. Unparalleled!" Hawthwaite made no reply. At that moment a policeman put his head inside the door and asked him to go to Dr. Wellesley, and he went off, leaving the two newspaper men together. Brent looked at Peppermore and suddenly put an abrupt question to him. "I guess you'll know," he said meaningly. "Was my cousin unpopular in this place?" Peppermore turned his big spectacles on his questioner and sank his voice to a whisper. "Between ourselves," he answered, "in some quarters, very." "Of late, I suppose?" suggested Brent. "Become gradually more and more so, Mr. Brent," said Peppermore. "You see, he only got elected Mayor by one vote. That meant that half the Council was against him against his policy and ideas, you know. Of course, he was a reformer. Those who didn't like him called him a meddler. And in my experience of this place 10 years it's a bad thing to meddle in Hathelsborough affairs. Too many vested interests, sir. Certainly, amongst some people, Mr. Wallingford was not at all popular. But murder!" "There are plenty of people who don't stick at that," remarked Brent. "But you wanted information. I'll give you some." He went on to tell how he and Bunning had found Wallingford, and of the difficulties of access to the Mayor's Parlour. "The thing is," he concluded, "how did the murderer get in, and how did he get away?" "Queer!" admitted Peppermore, scribbling fast in his note book. "That's a nice job for the detectives. Looks like a skilfully planned, premeditated job, too." Hawthwaite came in again, carrying something in his hand, concealed by a piece of brown paper. His face betokened a discovery. "Look here!" he said. "No secret about it. You can mention it, Peppermore. Just after you and I had gone out of the Mayor's Parlour, Mr. Brent, Bunning picked something out of the hearth, where it was half burnt, and what's left charred, and gave it to Dr. Wellesley. See!" He laid the brown paper on his desk, turned back the edges, and revealed part of a fine cambric pocket handkerchief, crumpled and blood-stained, charred and blackened. "Without a doubt," he whispered confidentially, "this belonged to the murderer. He got blood on his hands, he wiped them on this and threw it away on the fire to burn, and this half is not burned." End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. The Tannery House. During a moment's impressive silence, the three men, standing side by side at Hawthwaite's desk, stared at the blood-stained memento of the crime. Each was thinking the same thought. There before them was the life-blood of the man who, little more than an hour previously, had been full of energy, forcefulness, ambition. It was Peppermore who first spoke in an awe-stricken voice. "You'll take care of that, Mr. Superintendent," he said. "A clue." "I should just think so!" exclaimed Hawthwaite. He picked up a box of letter paper which lay close by, emptied it of its contents, and lifted the fragment of handkerchief by a corner. "That goes into my safe," he continued, as he placed his find in the box. "A clue, as you say, and an important one. That, as you may observe, is no common article. It's a gentleman's handkerchief fine cambric. If it had only been the other part of it, now, there'd probably have been a name on it, or initials wove into it. There's nothing of that sort you see on what's left. But it's something, and it may lead to a good deal." He put the cardboard box away in a safe and locked it up. Putting the key in his pocket, he gave Brent an informing glance. "I've had a word or two with the medical men while I was out there," he said confidentially. "They say there's no doubt as to how he was killed. The murderer, they're confident, was standing behind him as he himself was either writing or looking over the papers on his desk, and suddenly thrust a knife clean through his shoulders. They say death would have been instantaneous." "A knife!" muttered Brent. "Well," continued Hawthwaite, "as regards that, there are all sorts of knives. It would be a long, thin weapon," said Dr. Wellesley, "and Dr. Barber he suggested that it was the sort of wound that would be caused by one of those old fashioned rapiers. And they did say, both of them, that it had been used, whatever the weapon was, with great force, gone clean through." Peppermore was listening to these gruesome details with all the ardour of the born news seeker. But Brent turned away. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked. "Why, there isn't," replied Hawthwaite. "The fact is, there is nothing to do outside our work. The doctors are doing theirs, and there'll have to be an inquest, of course. I've sent to notify Mr. Seagrave, the coroner, already, and I'm having a thorough search made of the Moot Hall, and making inquiries about his Worship's last movements. There's nothing more can be done at present. One of my men has gone round to tell his landlady. It's a fortunate thing, Mr. Brent," he added with a knowing look, "that your cousin wasn't a married man. That would have been a fine thing to have to break to a man's wife and family. About relations, now, Mr. Brent, you'll know what to do? I know nothing about his private affairs." "Yes," answered Brent, "but I'm much more concerned just now about his public affairs. It seems to me indeed, it's no use trying to disguise it that this has arisen out of the fact that as Mayor of Hathelsborough he was concerning himself in bringing about some drastic reforms in the town. You probably know yourself that he wasn't popular." "Yes, yes, Mr. Brent," interrupted Hawthwaite. "But then, you know, murder I can't think there's anybody in this place would carry their likes to that length. Murder!" "You don't know," said Brent. "But at any rate, I'm my cousin's nearest blood relation, and I'm going to find out who killed him, if it's humanly possible. Now, who is there in the town who knows most about his public affairs? Who is there who's most conversant with whatever it was that he had in hand?" Hawthwaite seemed to consider matters. "Well, Alderman Crood, the tanner, is the Deputy Mayor," he replied at last. "I should say he's as good a man to go to as anybody, Mr. Brent. He's chairman of the Financial Committee, too, and it was in financial matters that Mr. Wallingford was wanting to make these reforms you've mentioned. If there's anything known I mean that I don't know Alderman Crood's the most likely man to know it." "Alderman Crood," remarked Peppermore softly, "knows everything that goes on in Hathelsborough everything." So to speak," said Hawthwaite. "There are things, of course " "Where does Alderman Crood live?" asked Brent. Already he was moving towards the door. "As I can do nothing here, I'll go to him at once. I'm not going to leave a stone unturned in this matter, Superintendent." "Quite right, Mr. Brent, quite right. Neither will I," asserted Hawthwaite. "Alderman Crood lives by his tannery, the far end of town. Anybody'll show you the place, once you're past the big church." "I'm going that way," remarked Peppermore. "Come with me, Mr. Brent." He led Brent out into St. Lawrence Lane, a narrow thoroughfare at the back of the Moot Hall, and turning a corner emerged on the market place, over which the night shadows had now fallen. "A terrible affair, this, Mr. Brent," he said as they walked along. and a most extraordinary one, too. It'll be more than a 9 days' wonder here. A deep mystery, sir, and I question if you'd get much light on it where you're going." "You said that Alderman Crood knew everything," observed Brent. "Aye," answered Peppermore with a short laugh, "but that isn't to say he'll tell everything or anything. Alderman Crood, Mr. Brent, is the closest man in this town, which is saying a good deal. Since I came here, sir, 10 years ago, I've learnt much, and if you'll drop in at the Monitor office any time you like, Mr. Brent, mornings preferable, I'll give you the benefit of my experience. Hathelsborough folk, sir, are, in my opinion, the queerest lot in all England. But you want to see Alderman Crood. Now, go to the end of the market place, turn down Barley Market, drop 100 yards or so down the hill at the end, and you'll smell Crood's tan yard, even if you don't see it. His is the big, solid-looking house at the side. You can't miss it." The editor-reporter shot up an alley at his left, at the head of which was a lighted window with "Monitor Office" on it in black letters, and Brent went on his way to seek the Deputy Mayor. As he passed Low Cross, and at the east end of the great church, and turned into the wide, irregular space called Barley Market, he tried to analyse his feelings about the tragic event on which he had chanced without warning. He had left Fleet Street early that afternoon, thinking of nothing but a few days' pleasant change, and here he was in that quiet old world town, faced with the fact that his kinsman and host had been brutally murdered at the very hour of his arrival. He was conscious of a fierce if dull resentment, the resentment of a tribesman who finds one of his clan done to death, and knows that the avenging of blood is on his shoulders from henceforth. He had no particular affection for his cousin, and therefore no great sense of personal loss, but Wallingford, after all, was of his breed, and he must bring the murderer to justice. Alderman Crood's house, big, broad, high, loomed up across him as the odours of the tan yard at its side and rear assailed his nostrils. As he went towards it, the front door opened a little, and a man came out. He and Brent met in the light of a street lamp, and Brent recognised a policeman whom he had seen in the Mayor's Parlour. The man recognised him and touched his helmet. Brent stopped. "Oh," he said, "have you been to tell Mr. Crood of what has happened?" "Just that, sir," replied the policeman. "He's Deputy Mayor, sir." "I know," said Brent. "Then he's at home?" "Yes, sir." Brent was going forward, but a sudden curiosity seized on him. He paused, glancing at the policeman suggestively. Did Mr. Crood say anything?" he asked. The policeman shook his head. "Nothing, sir, except that he supposed Superintendent Hawthwaite was seeing to everything." "Did you happen to tell him that I was here?" "I did, sir. I said his Worship's cousin from London had just come. No harm, sir, I hope?" "Not a bit. Glad you did," said Brent. "He'll expect me." He said good night to the man and walked forward to Alderman Crood's door. It was like the house to which it gave entrance, very high and broad, a massive affair, topped by a glass transom, behind which a light, very dim and feeble, was burning. Brent felt for and rang a bell, and heard it ring somewhere far off in the house. Then he waited so long that he was about to ring again, when he heard a bolt being withdrawn inside the big door, then another. Each creaked in a fashion that suggested small use and the need of a little oil. The door opened, and he found himself confronting a girl, who stood holding a small lamp in her hand. Behind her, at the far end of a gloomy, cavernous hall, a swinging lamp, turned low, silhouetted her figure. Something about the girl made Brent look at her with more attention than he would ordinarily have given. She was a tallish girl, whose figure would have been unusually good had it been properly filled out. As it was, she was thin, but only too thin for her proportions. Her thinness, had she been 3 inches shorter, would have passed for a graceful slenderness. But Brent took this in at a glance. His attention was more particularly concentrated on the girl's face, a delicate oval, framed in a mass of dark hair. She was all dark hair, an olive complexion, large, unusually lustrous dark eyes, fringed by long soft lashes, and an almost dark rose tint on her cheeks. And in the look which she gave him there was something as soft as her eyes, which were those of a shy animal, something appealing, pathetic. He glanced hastily at her attire, simple even to plainness, and wondered who she was and what was her exact status in that big house which seemed to require the service of a staff of domestics. Brent asked for Alderman Crood. The girl glanced towards the end of a hall and then looked at him doubtfully. "What name?" she inquired in tones that were little above a whisper. "My name's Brent," the caller answered in a clear, loud voice. Somehow he had a suspicion that Crood was listening at the other end of the cavernous hall. "I am Mr. Wallingford's cousin." The girl gave him a curious glance, and motioning him to wait, went away up the hall to a door which stood partly open, revealing a lighted interior. She disappeared within, came out again, walked a little way towards Brent, and spoke with a timid smile. "Will you please come this way?" she said. "Mr. Crood will see you." Brent strode up the hall, the girl preceding him, pushed open the door which she had just left. He walked into a big room and through a fog of tobacco smoke saw that he was in the presence of three men who sat in arm chairs round a hearth whereon a big fire of logs blazed. Behind their chairs a table was set out with decanters and glasses, a tobacco jar and cigar boxes. Clearly he had interrupted a symposium of a friendly and social sort. The visitor's eyes went straight to the obvious master of the house, a big, heavily built, massive framed man of 60 or thereabouts, who sat in state on the right hand side of the hearth. Brent took in certain details of his appearance at a glance: the broad, flabby, parchment hued face, wide mouth, square jaw, and small shrewd eyes, the suit of dead black broadcloth, and the ample black neckcloth swathed about an old fashioned collar. He noted, too, the fob which dangled from Alderman Crood's waist, and its ancient seals and ornaments. A survival of the past, Alderman Crood, he thought, in outward seeming, but there was that in his watchful expression which has belonged to man in every age. The small, shrewd eyes, in their turn, measured up Brent as he crossed the threshold, and Crood, seeing what he would have described as a well-dressed young gentleman who was evidently used to superior society, did what he certainly would not have done for any man in Hathelsborough. He rose from his chair and stretched out a hand. "How do you do, sir?" he said in a fat, unctuous voice. "The cousin of our lamented Mayor, poor gentleman, of whose terrible fate we have at this moment learned, sir. I can assure you, Mr. Brent, I think, and whatever other relations there may be, of our sincere sympathy, sir. I never knew a more deplorable thing in my life. And to happen just as you should arrive, on a visit to your cousin, Mr. Brent. Dear, dear! The constable who came to inform me of what had happened mentioned that you'd come, and we were just talking. But I'll introduce you to these gentlemen, sir, allow me. Mr. Mallett, our esteemed bank manager; Mr. Coppinger, our respected borough treasurer." Brent silently shook hands with the two other men; just as silently he made a sharp inspection of them as they resettled themselves in their chairs. Mallett, a spick and span sort of man, very precise as to the cut of his clothes, and particularly as to the quality of his linen and the trimmings of his old fashioned side whiskers, he set down at once as the personification of sly watchfulness. He was the type of person who would hear all and say no more than was necessary or obligatory. Coppinger, a younger man, had that same watchful look. A moment later Brent saw it in Crood's big face too. They were all watchful, all sly, these men, he decided, the sort who would sit by and listen, and admit nothing and tell nothing. Already before even he asked the questions which he had come to put, he knew that he would get no answer other than non-committal, evasive ones. He saw that all three men, instead of being anxious to give him information, were actuated by the same desire to find out what he knew, to hear what he had to say. Crood, as Brent seated himself, waved a hand towards the decanters on the table. "You'll try a little drop o' something, Mr. Brent?" he said, with insinuating hospitality. "A taste of whisky, now do you no harm after what you've just been through." He turned to the girl who had followed Brent into the room and, picking up her needlework, had seated herself near the master of the house. "Queenie, my love," he continued, "give the gentleman a whisky and soda. Say the word, sir. My niece, sir, Miss Queenie Crood, all my establishment, Mr. Brent. Quiet, old fashioned folk we are, but glad to see you, sir, though I wish the occasion had been a merrier one, oh dear!" Brent made the girl a polite bow, and not wishing to show himself stand offish, took the glass which she mixed and handed it to him. He turned to Crood. "It's not a pleasant occasion for me, sir," he said. "I am my cousin's nearest blood relative, and it lies with me to do what I can to find out who's responsible for his death. I understand that you are Deputy Mayor, so naturally you're conversant with his public affairs? Now, I've learnt within the last hour that he had become unpopular in the town made enemies. Is that so, Mr. Crood?" Crood, who was smoking a long churchwarden's pipe, took its stem from his lips and waved it in the air with an expressive motion. "Well, well!" he said soothingly. "There might ha' been a little of something of that sort, you know, Mr. Brent, but in a purely political sense, sir, an entirely political sense only. No personal feeling, you know, sir. I'm sure Mr. Mallett there will agree with me, and Mr. Coppinger too." "Absolutely," said Mallett. "Unreservedly," said Coppinger. "Your cousin, sir, our late lamented Mayor, was much respected in the town," continued Crood. "He was the hardest working Mayor we've had for many years, Mr. Brent." "A first rate man of business," observed Mallett. "A particularly clever hand at figures," remarked Coppinger. "A man as tried hard to do his duty," said Crood. "Of course, I'll not say that everybody saw eye to eye with him. They didn't. Wherever there's public bodies, Mr. Brent, there'll be parties. Your poor cousin had his party, and there was, to be sure, a party against him and his. But you'll be well aware, sir, as a London gentleman that no doubt often visits Parliament, that here in England men is enemies in politics that's firm friends outside 'em. I believe I may say that that's a fact, sir?" "Oh, no doubt," agreed Brent. He was already feeling at a loss, and he scarcely knew what to say next. "I heard, though, that my cousin, as Mayor, was proposing such drastic reforms in the administration of your borough affairs that well, in short, that personal feeling had been imported." Crood shook his head more solemnly than ever. "I think you've been misinformed on that point, Mr. Brent," he said. "There may be no doubt are mischievous persons that would say such things, but I never heard nothing of the sort, sir. Political feeling, perhaps, but personal feeling, no." "Nothing of the sort," said Coppinger. "Now, I should say," remarked Crood, waving his pipe again, "that our late lamented Mayor, as an individual, was much thought of amongst the townspeople. I believe Mr. Mallett will agree with that, and Mr. Coppinger." "A great deal thought of," answered Mallett. "By, I should say, everybody," added Coppinger. "He was, of course, a comparative stranger," continued Crood. "12 years only had he been amongst us, and now cut off, sudden and malicious, at the beginning of his career. But well thought of, sir, well thought of." "Then you feel sure that this crime has not sprung out of his public affairs?" suggested Brent. "It's not what you'd call a political murder?" "Of that, sir, I would take my solemn oath," declared Crood. "The idea, sir, is ridiculous." "Absurd!" said Mallett. "Out of the question!" affirmed Coppinger. "Why, then, has he been murdered?" asked Brent. "What's at the bottom of it?" All three men shook their heads. They looked at each other. They looked at Brent. "I wot!" said Crood. "Just so," agreed Mallett. "That's precisely where it is," concluded Coppinger. "Exactly." "More in it than anyone knows of, most probably, at present, Mr. Brent," observed Crood, with solemn significance. "Time, sir, time! Time, sir, may tell. May. Brent saw that he was not going to get any information under that roof, and after a further brief exchange of trite observations he rose to take his leave. Alderman Crood wrung his hand. "Sorry I am, sir, that your first visit to my establishment should be under such painful circumstances," he said unctuously. "I hope you'll favour me with another talk, sir. Always pleased to see a London gentleman, I'm sure. We're behind, perhaps, in these parts, Mr. Brent, but honest and hearty, sir, honest and hearty. Queenie, my love, you'll open the door for the young gentleman?" The girl took Brent into the gloomy hall. Half way along its shadows she suddenly turned on him with a half shy, half daring expression. "You are from London?" she whispered. "From London? Yes," said Brent. "Why?" "I want to talk to somebody about London," she went on, with a nervous backward glance at the door they had just left. Will you let me talk to you?" "To be sure," answered Brent. "But when? Where?" "I go into the Castle grounds every afternoon," she answered timidly. "Could you come there some time?" "To morrow afternoon?" suggested Brent. "Say 3:00. Would that do?" "Yes," she whispered. "Thank you. I'll be there. It seems queer, but I'll tell you. Thank you again. You'll understand to morrow." She had her hand on the big street door by then. Without more words she let him out into the night. He heard the door close heavily behind him. He went back towards the heart of the little town wondering. Only a few hours before he had been in the rush and bustle of Fleet Street, and now here he was, 200 miles away, out of the world, and faced with an atmosphere of murder and mystery. Chapter 4 of The Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. Bull's Snug. When Brent came again to the centre of the town he found that Hathelsborough, instead of sinking to sleep within an hour of curfew, according to long established custom, had awakened to new life. There were groups at every corner, and little knots of folk at doors, and men in twos and threes on the pavement, and it needed no particular stretching of his ears to inform him that everybody was talking of the murder of his cousin. He caught fragmentary bits of surmise and comment. Near a shadowy corner of the great church he purposely paused, pretending to tie his shoelace in order to overhear a conversation between 3 or 4 men who had just emerged from the door of an adjacent tavern and were talking in loud, somewhat excited tones, working men whose speech was in the vernacular. "You can bet your life that this job's been done by them whose little game Wallingford were going to checkmate," declared one man. "I've allus said 'at he were running a rare old risk. We know what t'old saying is about new brooms sweeping clean. All very well is that, but ye can smash a new broom if you use it over vigorously. Wallingford were going a bit too deeply into the abuses of this town, and he's paid the penalty. Put out o' the way, that's the truth on it." "Happen it may be," said a second man, "and happen not. There's no denying 'at the Mayor were what they call a man o' mystery. A mysterious chap, d'ye see, in his comings and goings. You don't know 'at he mayn't have had secret enemies. After all, he were nowt but a stranger at the town, nobbut but here 12 years or so. How do we know what about 'em? It may be summat to do with the past, this here affair. I'm none going to believe 'at there's anybody in Hathelsborough 'ud stick a knife into him just because he were cleaning up the town money affairs, like." "Never you mind," asserted the former speaker. "He were going to touch the pockets of some on 'em pretty considerable, were t' Mayor. And you know what Hathelsborough folk is when their pockets is touched they'll stick at nought. He's been put away, has Wallingford, 'cause he were here interfering over much." Brent walked on, reflecting. His own opinions coincided, uncomfortably but decidedly, with those of the last speaker, and a rapidly growing feeling of indignation and desire for vengeance welled up within him. He looked round at the dark walled, closely shuttered old houses about him with a sense of dull anger. Surely they were typical of the reserve, the cunning watchfulness, the suggestive silences of the folk who lived in them, of whom he had just left three excellent specimens in Crood, Mallett and Coppinger. How was he, a stranger, going to unearth the truth about his cousin's brutal murder amongst people like these, endowed, it seemed to him, with an Eastern-like quality of secretiveness? But he would. He went on to the rooms in which Wallingford had lived ever since his first coming to the town. They were good, roomy, old-fashioned apartments in a big house, cosy and comfortable, but the sight of Wallingford's study, of his desk, his books and papers, of his favourite chair and his slippers at the fire, of the supper table already spread for him and Brent in an inner parlour, turned Brent sick at heart. He turned hastily to Wallingford's landlady, who had let him in and followed him into the dead man's room. "It's no use, Mrs. Appleyard," he said. "I can't stop here to night, anyway. It would be too much. I'll go to the Chancellor and send on for my luggage." The woman nodded, staring at him wonderingly. The news had evidently wrought a curious change in her. Usually she was a cheery, good-natured, rather garrulous woman, but she looked at Brent now as if something had dazed her. "Mr. Brent," she whispered in awe-stricken accents, "you could have knocked me down with a feather when they came here and told me. He was that well and cheerful when he went out." "Yes," said Brent dully. "Yes." He let his eyes run over the room again. He had looked forward to having a long, intimate chat with Wallingford that night over the bright fire, still crackling and glowing in readiness for host and guests. "Aye, well," he added, "it's done now." "Them police fellows, Mr. Brent," said the landlady, "have they any idea who did it?" "I don't think they've the least idea yet," replied Brent. "I trust you haven't either." Mrs. Appleyard, thus spurred to reminiscence, recovered something of her customary loquaciousness. "No, to be sure I haven't," she answered. "But I've heard things, and I wish I do wish that I'd warned him. I ought to 'a' done." "What about?" asked Brent. "And what things?" The landlady hesitated a little, shaking her head. "Well, you know, Mr. Brent," she said at last, "in a little town like this folk will talk. Hathelsborough's a particular bad place for talk and gossip. For all that, Hathelsborough people's as secret as the grave when they like about their own affairs. And as I say, I've heard things. There's a woman comes here to work for me at odd times, a woman that sometimes goes to put a day or two at Marriner's laundry, where a lot of women works, and I recollect her telling me not so long since that there was talk amongst those women about the Mayor and his interfering with things, and she'd heard some of 'em remark that he'd best keep his fingers out of the pie or he'd pay for it. No more, Mr. Brent, but a straw'll show which way the wind blows. I'm sure there was them in the town that wanted to get rid of him. All the same, murder!" "Just so," said Brent. "Well, I've got to find that all out." He went away to the Chancellor Hotel, made his arrangements, sent to Mrs. Appleyard's for his luggage, and eventually turned into bed. But it was little sleep that Brent got that night, and he was thankful when morning came and he could leave his bed and find relief in activity. He was out and about while the grey mist still hung around the Hathelsborough elms, and at 8 o'clock walked into the police station, anxious for news. Hawthwaite had no news for him. Late the previous night, and early that morning, the police had carried out an exhaustive search of the old Moot Hall, and had failed to discover anything that seemed to bear relation to the crime. Also, they had made themselves acquainted with the murdered man's movements immediately previous to his arrival at the Moot Hall. There was nothing whatever in them that afforded any clue. "We know all that he did from 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon to the time you found him, Mr. Brent," said Hawthwaite. "He left his office at 5 o'clock and went home to his rooms. He was there till nearly 7 o'clock. He went out then and walked round by Abbey Lodge, where he left some books novels, or something of the sort for Mrs. Saumarez. Then " "Who's Mrs. Saumarez?" asked Brent. She's a young widow lady, very wealthy, it's understood, who came to live in the town some 2 years ago," replied Hawthwaite. "Very handsome young woman. You'll be seeing her. Between you and me," he added, with a knowing glance, "his Worship late Worship, I should say had been showing her great attention, and I don't think she was indifferent to him. He used to go and dine with her a good deal, anyway. However, that's neither here nor there just now. He called, I say, at Abbey Lodge, left these books, and then came on to the Moot Hall, as Bunning said. That's the plain truth about his movements." "I don't think his movements matter," observed Brent. "What does matter is, what were the movements of the murderer, and how did he get into the Mayor's Parlour? Or was he concealed there when my cousin entered, and if so, how did he get out and away?" "Aye, just so, Mr. Brent," agreed Hawthwaite. "As to that we know nothing, so far. But it was of importance to find out about your cousin's own movements, because, you see, he might have been seen, for instance, in conversation with some strangers, or in something of that sort, and it all helps." "You don't know anything about the presence of any strangers in the town last night?" inquired Brent. "Oh, we're satisfied ourselves about that," replied Hawthwaite. "We made full inquiries last night at the railway station and at the hotels. There were no strangers came into the town last night, or evening, or afternoon, barring yourself and a couple of commercial travellers who are well known here. We saw to that particular at once." "Then you really found out nothing?" suggested Brent. "Nothing," asserted Hawthwaite. "But the inquest won't be held until to morrow morning, and by then we may know something. And in the meantime, sir, there's something you might do, Mr. Brent. I gather that you're his next of kin? Very well, sir, then you might examine his papers, private papers and so on. You never know what bit of sidelight you might come upon." "Very good," said Brent. "But I shall want help large help in that. Can you recommend a solicitor, now?" "There's Mr. Tansley," replied Hawthwaite. "His office is next door to his late Worship's. A sound man, Tansley, Mr. Brent. And, if I were you, I should get Tansley to represent you at the inquest to morrow. Legal assistance is a good thing to have, sir, at an affair of that sort." Brent nodded his acquiescence and went back to his hotel. He was thankful that there were few guests in the house. He had no wish to be stared at as a principal actor in the unfolding drama. Yet he speedily realized that he had better lay aside all squeamish feelings of that sort. He foresaw that the murder of its Mayor would throw Hathelsborough into the fever of a 9 days' wonder, and that his own activities would perforce draw attention to himself. And there were things to be done, and after he had breakfasted he set resolutely and systematically about doing them. Tansley's office first. He made an arrangement with Tansley to meet him at Wallingford's rooms that afternoon, to go through any private papers that might be found there. Then his cousin's office. There were clerks there, awaiting instructions. Brent had to consult with them as to what was to be done about business. And, that over, there was another and still more difficult task the arrangements for Wallingford's interment. Of one thing Brent was determined whatever Alderman Crood, as Deputy Mayor, or whatever the aldermen and councillors of Hathelsborough desired, he, as the murdered man's next of kin, was not going to have any public funeral or demonstration. It roused his anger to white heat to think of even the bare possibility of Wallingford's murderer following him in smug hypocrisy to his grave. And in Brent's decided opinion that murderer was a Hathelsborough man, and one of high place. It was nearly noon when he had completed these arrangements, and then, having no more to do at the moment, he remembered the little newspaper man, Peppermore, and his invitation to call at the Monitor office. So, as 12 o'clock chimed and struck from the tower of St. Hathelswide's, he walked up the narrow entry from the market place, along which the editor-reporter had shot the previous night, and after a preliminary reconnoitring of the premises, tapped at a door marked "Editorial." A shrill voice bade him enter, and he turned the handle to find himself inspecting an unusually untidy and littered room, the atmosphere of which seemed to be chiefly derived from a mixture of gas, paste, and printer's ink. Somewhere beyond sounded the monotonous rumble of what was probably an old fashioned printing machine. A small figured, sharp faced, red haired youngster of apparently 15 or 16 years was the sole occupant of this unsavoury sanctum. He was very busy, so busy that he had divested himself of his jacket and had rolled up his shirt sleeves. In his right hand he wielded a pair of scissors. With them he was industriously clipping paragraphs from a pile of newspapers which lay before him on a side table. It was evident that he had a sharp eye for telling stuff, for in the moment which elapsed after Brent's entrance he had run it over a column, swooped on a likely item, snipped it out and added it to a heap of similar gleanings at his elbow. He glanced at his caller with an expression which was of the sort that discourages wasting of time. "Mr. Peppermore?" inquired Brent, taking his cue. "In?" "Out," answered the boy. "Long?" demanded Brent. "Can't say," said the busy one. "Might be and mightn't." Then he gave Brent a close inspection. "If it's news," he added, "I can take it. Is it?" "No news," replied Brent. "Mr. Peppermore asked me to call. I'll wait." He perched himself on the counter and watched the scissors. "You're the sub editor, I reckon?" he said at last with a smile. "Eh?" "I'm all sorts of things in this blooming office," answered the boy. "We're short handed here, I can tell you. Takes me and Mr. P. and all our time to get the paper out. Why, last week Mr. P. he didn't have time to write his editorial. We had to shove an old one in. But, Lor bless you, I don't believe anyone reads 'em. Liveliness and something about turnips that's what our folks likes. However, they'll have some good stuff this week. We'd a real first class murder in this town last night the Mayor. Heard about it?" "I've heard," said Brent. "Um! And how long have you been at that job?" "12 months," replied the boy. "I was in the law before that 6 months. But the law didn't suit me. Slow. There's some go in this bit too much now and then. What we want is another reporter. Comes hard on me and Mr. Peppermore times. I did 2 cricket matches, a fire, a lost child, and a drowning case last Saturday." "Good!" said Brent. "Know any shorthand?" "I can do a fair bit," answered the man of all work. "Learning. Can you?" "Some," replied Brent. "Did a lot once. What system?" But just then Peppermore, more in a hurry than ever, came bustling in to beam brightly through his spectacles at the sight of his visitor. "Mr. Brent!" he exclaimed. "Delighted, my dear sir! Charmed! Not often our humble roof is extended over a distinguished visitor. Take a chair, sir. But no stop! I've an idea." He seized Brent by the lapel of his coat and became whispering and mysterious. "Step outside," he said. 12 o'clock. We'll go over to Bull's." "What's Bull's?" asked Brent as they went out into the entry. Peppermore laughed and wagged his finger. "Bull's, sir?" he said. "Bull's? Centre of all the gossip in Hathelsborough. Come across there and have a quiet glass with me, and keep your eyes and ears open. I've been trying all the morning to get some news, ideas, impressions, about the sad events of last night, Mr. Brent. Now, for current criticism, Bull's is the place. All the gossips of the town congregate there, sir." "All right," agreed Brent. "Show the way." Peppermore led him down the narrow entry, across the market place, and into an equally narrow passage that opened between 2 shops near High Cross. There Brent found himself confronted by what seemed to be a high, blank, doorless and windowless wall. Peppermore perceived his astonishment and laughed. "Some queer, odd nooks and corners in Hathelsborough, Mr. Brent," he said knowingly. "It would take a stranger a long time to find out all the twists and turns in this old town. But everybody knows the way to Bull's Snug, and here we are." He suddenly made a sharp turn to the right and into another passage, where he pushed open a door, steered his companion by the elbow through a dark entry, and thrusting aside a heavy curtain, ushered him into as queer a place as Brent had ever seen. It was a big, roomy apartment, lavishly ornamented with old sporting prints and trophies of the rustic chase. Its light came from the top through a skylight of coloured glass. Its floor was sawdusted. There were shadowy nooks and recesses in it, and on one side ran a bar, presided over by two hefty men in their shirt sleeves. And here, about the bar, and in knots up and down the room and at the little tables in the corners, was a noontide assemblage, every man with a glass in his hand or at his elbow. Peppermore drew Brent into a vacant alcove and gave him a significant glance. "I guess there isn't a man in this room, Mr. Brent, that hasn't got his own theory about what happened last night," he murmured. "I don't suppose any of 'em know you they're not the sort of men you'd meet when you were here before. These are all chiefly tradesmen, betting men, sportsmen, and so on. But, as I say, if you want the gossip of the town, here's the place. There never was a rumour in Hathelsborough but it was known and canvassed and debated and improved upon in Bull's within an hour. Every scandalmonger and talebearer comes here. And here's," he continued, suddenly dropping his voice to a whisper, "one of the biggest of 'em. Watch him and listen to him if he comes near us. That tall, thin man in the grey suit the man with the grizzled moustache. Listen, Mr. Brent, I'll tell you who that chap is, for he's one of the queerest and at the same time most interesting characters in the town. That, sir, is Krevin Crood, the ne'er do well brother of Mr. Alderman Crood. Watch him." Chapter 5 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. Sleeping fires. Already interested in the Crood family because of what he had seen of Simon Crood and his niece on the previous evening, Brent looked closely at the man whom Peppermore pointed out. There was no resemblance in him to his brother, the Alderman. He was a tall, spare, fresh-coloured man, apparently about 50 years of age, well bred of feature, carefully groomed, something in his erect carriage, slightly swaggering air, and defiant eye suggested the military man. Closer inspection showed Brent that the grey tweed suit, though clean and scrupulously pressed, was much worn, that the brilliantly polished shoes were patched, that the linen, freshly laundered though it was far from new. Everything, indeed, about Krevin Crood suggested a well-kept man of former grandeur. "Decayed old swell, that's what he looks like, eh, Mr. Brent?" whispered Peppermore, following his companion's thoughts. "Ah, they say that once upon a time Kevin Crood was the biggest buck in Hathelsborough used to drive his horses and ride his horses and all the rest of it. And now come down to that." He winked significantly as he glanced across the room, and Brent knew what he meant. Krevin Crood, lofty and even haughty in manner as he was, had lounged near the bar and stood looking around him, nodding here and there as he met the eye of an acquaintance. "Waiting till somebody asks him to drink," muttered Peppermore. "Regular sponge, he is. And once used to crack his bottle of champagne with the best." "What's the story?" asked Brent, still quietly watching the subject of Peppermore's remarks. "Oh, the old one," said Peppermore. "Kevin Crood was once a solicitor and Town Clerk, and, as I say, the biggest swell in the place. Making his couple of thousand a year, I should think. Come down in the usual fashion drink, gambling, extravagance, and so on. And in the end they had to get rid of him as magistrate's clerk, I mean. It was impossible to keep him on any longer. He'd frittered away his solicitor's practice, too, by that time, and come to the end of his resources. But Simon was already a powerful man in the town, so he and some others, cooked things nicely for Krevin. Krevin Crood, Mr. Brent, is one of the Hathelsborough abuses that your poor cousin meant to rid the ratepayers of. Fact, sir." "How?" asked Brent. "Well," continued Peppermore, I said that Simon and some others cooked things for him. Instead of dismissing Krevin for incompetence and inattention to his duties, they retired him with a pension. Krevin Crood, sir, draws £156 a year out of the revenues of this rotten little borough, all because he's Simon's brother. Been drawing that £3 a week for 15 years now. It's a scandal. However, as I say, he once had 2,000 a year." "A difference," remarked Brent. "Aye, well, he adds his bit to the £3," said Peppermore. "He does odd jobs for people. For one thing, he carries out all Dr. Wellesley's medicines for him. And he shows strangers round the place. He knows all about the history and antiquities of the castle, St. Hathelswide, St. Lawrence, and the Moot Hall, and so on. A hanger on and a sponge that's what he is, Mr. Brent. But clever as clever, sir, as he's unprincipled." "The Croods seem to be an interesting family," observed Brent. "Who was that girl that I saw last night? The Alderman's niece. Is she, by any chance, this chap's daughter?" "Queenie," said Peppermore. "Pretty girl, too, that, Mr. Brent. No, sir, she's this chap's niece and Simon's. She's the daughter of another Crood, Ben Crood. Ben's dead. He never made anything out, either died, I believe, as poor as a church mouse. Simon's the moneyed man of the Crood family the old rascal rolls at brass, as they call it here. So he took Queenie out of charity, and I'll bet my Sunday hat that he gets out of her the full equivalent of all that he gives her. Catch him giving anything for nothing." "You don't love Alderman Crood?" suggested Brent. Peppermore picked up his glass of bitter ale and drank off what remained. He set down the glass with a bang. "Wouldn't trust him any farther than I could throw his big carcass," he said with decision. "Nor any more than I would Krevin there bad 'uns, both of them. But hullo! as nobody's come forward this morning, Krevin's treating himself to a drink. That's his way he'll get his drink for nothing if he can, but if he can't he's always got money. Old cadger!" Brent was watching Krevin Crood. As Peppermore had just said, nobody had joined Krevin at the bar, and now he was superintending the mixing of a drink which one of the shirt sleeved barmen was preparing for him. Presently, glass in hand, he drew near a little knot of men, who in the centre of the room were gossiping in whispers. One of the men turned on him. "Well, and what's Sir Oracle got to say about it?" he demanded, with something like a covert sneer. "You'll know all about it, Krevin, I reckon. What's your opinion?" Krevin Crood looked over the speaker with a quiet glance of conscious superiority. However much he might have come down in the world, he still retained the manners of a well bred and educated man, and Brent was not surprised to hear a refined and cultured accent when he presently spoke. "If you are referring to the unfortunate and lamentable occurrence of last night, Mr. Spelliker," he answered, "I prefer to express no opinion. The matter is sub judice." "Latin!" sneered the questioner. "Aye, you can hide a deal o' truth away behind Latin, you old limbs of the law. But I reckon the truth'll come out all the same." "It is not a legal maxim, but a sound old English saying that murder will out," remarked Krevin quietly. "I think you may take it, Mr. Spelliker, that in this case, as in most others, the truth will be arrived at." "Aye, well, if all accounts be true, it's a good job for such as you that the Mayor is removed," said Spelliker, half insolently. "They say he was going to be down on all you pensioned gentlemen. What?" "That, again, is a matter which I do not care to discuss," replied Krevin. He turned away, approaching a horsey looking individual who stood near. "Good morning, Mr. Gates," he said pleasantly. "Got rid of your brown cob yet? If not, I was talking to Simpson, the vet, yesterday. I rather fancy you'd find a customer in him." Peppermore nudged his companion's arm. Brent leaned nearer to him. "Not get any change out of him," whispered Peppermore. "Cool old customer, isn't he? Sub judice, eh? Good! And yet, if there's a man in all Hathelsborough that's likely to know what straws are sailing on the undercurrent, Mr. Brent, Krevin Crood's the man. But you'll come across him before you're here long. Nobody can be long in Hathelsborough without knowing Krevin." They left Bull's then, and after a little talk in the market place about the matter of paramount importance, Brent returned to the Chancellor, thinking about what he had just seen and heard. It seemed to him, now more assuredly than ever, that he was in the midst of a peculiarly difficult maze, in a network of chicanery and deceit, in an underground borough full of twistings and turnings that led he could not tell whither. An idea had flashed through his mind as he looked at Krevin Crood in the broken man's brief interchange of remarks with the half insolent tradesman an idea which he had been careful not to mention to Peppermore. Krevin Crood, said Peppermore, was mainly dependent on his pension of £3 a week from the borough authorities, a pension which of course was terminable at the pleasure of those authorities. Wallingford had let it be known, plainly and unmistakably, that he was going to advocate the discontinuance of these drains of the town's resources. Krevin Crood, accordingly, would be one of the first to suffer if Wallingford got his way, as he was likely to do. And Peppermore had said further that Krevin Crood knew all about the antiquities of Hathelsborough, knew so much, indeed, that he acted as cicerone to people who wanted to explore the castle and the church and the Moot Hall. Now, supposing that Krevin Crood, with his profound knowledge of the older parts of the town, knew of some mysterious and secret way into the Mayor's Parlour, and had laid in wait there, resolved on killing the man who was threatening by his reforming actions to deprive him of his pension? It was not an impossible theory. And others branched out of it. It was already evident to Brent that Simon Crood, big man though he was in the affairs of the borough, was a schemer and a contriver of mole's work. Supposing that he and his gang had employed Krevin Crood as their emissary? That, too, was possible. Underground work. There was underground work all round. Then, thinking of Alderman Crood, he remembered Alderman Crood's niece, her request to him, his promise to her. He had been puzzled, not a little taken aback, by the girl's eager, anxious manner. She had been quiet and demure enough as she sat by Simon Crood's fire, sewing in silence, a veritable modest mouse, timid and bashful, but in that big, gloomy hall her attitude had changed altogether. She had been almost compelling in her eagerness. And Brent had wondered ever since, at intervals, whatever it could be that she wanted with him, a stranger. But it was near 3:00 now, and instead of indulging in further surmise, he went off to meet her. Hathelsborough Castle, once one of the notable fortresses of the north, still remained in an excellent state of preservation. Its great Norman keep formed a landmark that could be seen over many a mile of the surrounding country. Many of its smaller towers were still intact, and its curtained walls, barbican, and ancient chapel had escaped the ravages of time. The ground around it had been laid out as a public garden, and its great courtyard turned into a promenade, set out with flower beds. It was a great place of resort for the townsfolk on summer evenings and on Sundays, but Brent, coming to it in the middle of the afternoon, found it deserted, save for a few nursemaids and children. He went wandering around it, and suddenly caught sight of Queenie Crood. She was sitting on a rustic bench in an angle of the walls, a book in her hand. It needed little of Brent's perception to convince him that the book was unread. She was anxiously expecting him. "Here I am," he said, with an encouraging smile, as he sat down beside her. "Punctual to the minute, you see." He looked closely at her. In the clearer light of day he saw that she was not only a much prettier girl than he had fancied the night before, but that she had more fire and character in her eyes and lips than he had imagined. And though she glanced at him with evident shyness as he came up, and the colour came into her cheeks as she gave him her hand, he was quick to see that she was going to say whatever it was that was in her mind. It was Brent's way to go straight to the point. "You wanted to speak to me," he said, smiling again. "Fire away, and don't be afraid." The girl threw her book aside and turned to him with obvious candour. "I won't!" she exclaimed. "I'm not a bit afraid, though I don't know whatever you'll think of me, Mr. Brent, asking advice from a stranger in this barefaced fashion." "I've had to seek advice from strangers more than once in my time," said Brent, with a gentle laugh. "Go ahead." "It was knowing that you came from London," said Queenie. "You mightn't think it, but I never met anybody before who came from London. And I want to go to London. I will go." "Well," remarked Brent slowly, "if young people say they want to go to London, and declare that they will go to London, why, in my experience, they end up by going. But in your case, why not?" The girl sat silent for a moment, staring straight in front of her at the blue smoke that circled up from the quaint chimney stacks of the town beneath the castle. Her eyes grew dreamy. "I want to go on the stage," she said at last. "That's it, Mr. Brent." Brent turned and looked at her. Under his calm and critical inspection she blushed, but as she blushed she shook her head. "Perhaps you think I'm one of the stage-struck young women," she said. "Perhaps you're wondering if I can act. Perhaps " "What I'm wondering," interrupted Brent, "is if you know anything about it. Not about acting, but about the practical side of the thing the profession. A pretty stiff proposition, you know." "What I know," said Queenie Crood determinedly, "is that I've got a natural talent for acting. And I'd get on if only I could get away from this place. I will get away if only somebody would give me a bit of advice about going to London and getting you know getting put in the way of it. I don't care how hard the life is, nor how hard I'd have to work. It would be what I want, and better than this anyway." "You aren't happy in this town?" suggested Brent. Queenie gave an eloquent glance out of her dark eyes. "Happy!" she exclaimed scornfully. "Shut up in that house with Simon Crood? Would you be? You saw something of it last night. Would you like to be mewed up there, day in, day out, year in, year out, with no company beyond him and those two cronies of his, who are as bad as himself, mean, selfish, money grubbers? Oh!" "Isn't your uncle good to you?" asked Brent, with simple directness. "He's been good enough in giving me bed and board and clothing since my father and mother died 6 years ago," answered the girl. "And in return I've saved him the wages of 2 servants he ought to have. But you think I want to spend all my life there, doing that sort of thing? I don't, and I won't. And I thought when I heard that you were a London man, and a journalist, that you'd be able to tell me what to do to get to London. Help me, Mr. Brent." She involuntarily held out her hands to him, and Brent, just as involuntarily, took them in his. He was a cool and not easily impressed young man, but his pulses thrilled as he felt the warm fingers against his own. "By George!" he exclaimed. "If you can act like that!" "I'm not acting," she said quickly. "Well, well, I didn't say you were," he answered with a laugh. "Only if you could but of course I'll help you. I'll find out a thing or two for you. I don't know much myself, but I know people who do know. I'll do what I can." The girl pressed his hands and withdrew her own. "Thank you," she said impulsively. "Oh, if you only knew how I want to get away and breathe that house " "Look here," interrupted Brent. "You're very candid. I like that. It suits me. Now, frankly, you don't like that old uncle of yours? And just why?" Queenie looked round. There was no one near them, no one indeed in sight except a nursemaid who wheeled a perambulator along one of the paths, but she sunk her voice to something near a whisper. "Mr. Brent," she said, "Simon Crood's the biggest hypocrite in this town, and that's implying a good deal more than you'd ever think. He and those friends of his, Mallett and Coppinger, who are always there with him. Ah, they think I know nothing and understand nothing, but I hear their schemings and their talk, veiled as it is. They're deep and subtle, those three, and dangerous. Didn't you see last night that if you'd sat there till midnight or till morning, you'd never have had a word out of them a word, that is, that you wanted? You wouldn't. They knew better." I got nothing out of them," admitted Brent. He sat thinking in silence for a time. "Look here," he said at last. "You know what I want to find out who killed my cousin. Help me. Keep your eyes and ears open to anything you see and hear. Understand?" "I will," answered Queenie. "But you've got a big task before you. You can be certain of this. If the Mayor was murdered for what you called political reasons " "Well?" asked Brent as she paused. "Well?" "It would all be arranged so cleverly that there's small chance of discovery," she went on. "I know this town rotten to the core. But I'll help you all I can, and " A policeman suddenly came round the corner of the wall, and at the sight of Brent touched his peaked cap. "Looking for you, Mr. Brent," he said. "I'd heard you'd been seen coming up here. The superintendent would be obliged if you'd step round, sir. He wants to see you at once, particularly." "Follow you in a moment," answered Brent. He turned to Queenie as the man went away. "When shall I see you again?" he asked. "I always come here every afternoon," she answered. "It's the only change I get. I come here to read." "Till to morrow, or the next day, then," said Brent. He nodded and laughed. "Keep smiling. You'll maybe play Juliet or some other of those old games yet." The girl smiled gratefully, and Brent strode away after the policeman. In a few minutes he was in Hawthwaite's office. The superintendent closed the door, gave him a mysterious glance, and going over to a cupboard produced a long, narrow parcel done up in brown paper. "A discovery," he whispered. "It occurred to me this afternoon to have all the heavy furniture in the Mayor's Parlour examined. No light job, Mr. Brent, but we found this." And with a jerk of his wrist he drew from the brown paper a long, thin, highly polished rapier, the highly burnished steel of which was dulled along half its length, as if it had been first dimmed and then hastily rubbed. "I make no doubt that this was what it was done with," continued Hawthwaite. "We found it thrust away between the wainscoting and a heavy bookcase which it took 6 men to move. And our Deputy Town Clerk says a few days ago he saw this lying on a side table in the Mayor's Parlour. His late Worship observed to him that it was an old Spanish rapier that he'd picked up at some old curiosity shop, cheap." "You'll go into that and bring it in evidence?" suggested Brent. "You bet!" replied Hawthwaite grimly. "Oh, we're not going to sleep, Mr. Brent. We'll get at something yet. Slow and sure, sir, slow but sure." Brent went away presently, and calling on Tansley, the solicitor, walked with him to Wallingford's rooms. During the next 2 hours they carefully examined all the dead man's private papers. They found nothing that threw any light whatever on his murder. But they came upon his will. Wallingford had left all he possessed to his cousin Richard Brent, and by the tragedy of the previous night Brent found that he had benefited to the extent of some £15,000. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. The ancient office of coroner. The discovery of Wallingford's will, which lay uppermost amongst a small collection of private papers in a drawer of the dead man's desk, led Brent and Tansley into a new train of thought. Tansley, with the ready perception and acumen of a man trained in the law, was quick to point out 2 or 3 matters which in the view of Wallingford's murder seemed to be of high importance, perhaps of deep significance. Appended to the will was a schedule of the testator's properties and possessions, with the total value of the estate estimated and given in precise figures. That was how Brent suddenly became aware that he had come into a small fortune. Then the will itself was in holograph, written out in Wallingford's own hand on a single sheet of paper, in the briefest possible fashion, and witnessed by his 2 clerks, and most important and significant of all, it had been executed only a week previously. "Do you know how that strikes me?" observed Tansley in a low voice, as if he feared to be overheard. "It just looks to me as if Wallingford had anticipated that something was about to happen. Had he ever given you any idea in his letters that he was going to do this?" "Never," replied Brent. "Still, I'm the only very near relative that he had." "Well," said Tansley, "it may be mere coincidence, but it's a bit odd that he should be murdered within a week of that will's being made. I'd just like to know if he'd been threatened openly, anonymously, any way. Looks like it." "I suppose we shall get into things at the inquest?" asked Brent. Tansley shrugged his shoulders. "Maybe," he answered. "I've no great faith in inquests myself. But sometimes things do come out. And our Coroner Seagrave is a painstaking and thoroughgoing sort of old chap the leading solicitor in the town, too. But it all depends on what evidence can be brought forward. I've always an uneasy feeling, as regards a coroner's inquiry, that the very people who really could tell something never come forward." "Doesn't that look as if such people were keeping something back that would incriminate themselves?" suggested Brent. "Not necessarily," replied Tansley. "But it often means that it might incriminate others. And in an old town like this, where the folk are very clannish and closely connected one with another by literally centuries of intermarriage between families, you're not going to get one man to give another away." "You think that even if the murderer is known, or if some one's suspected, he would be shielded?" asked Brent. "In certain eventualities, yes," answered Tansley. "We all know that rumours about your cousin's murder are afloat in the town now, and spreading. Well, the more they spread, the closer and more secretive will those people become who are in the know. That is, of course, if anybody is in the know. That's a fact." "What do you think yourself?" said Brent suddenly. "Come, now!" "I think the Mayor was got rid of, and very cleverly," replied Tansley. "So cleverly that I'm doubtful if to morrow's inquest will reveal anything. However, it's got to be held." "Well, you'll watch it for me," said Brent. "I'm going to spare no expense and no pains to get at the truth." He sat at Tansley's side when the inquest was opened next morning in the principal court of the old Moot Hall. It struck him as rather a curious fact that although he had followed the profession of journalist for several years, he had never until then been present at the holding of this, one of the most ancient forms of inquiry known to English law. But he was familiar with the history of the thing. He knew that ever since the days of Edward IV the coroner had held his sitting, super visum corporis, with the aid of at least 12 jurymen, probi et legales homines. There was scarcely in all the range of English legal economy an office more ancient. He inspected the coroner and his jury with curious interest. Seagrave, coroner of the honour of Hathelsborough, was a keen-faced old lawyer, whose astute looks were relieved by a kindly expression. His 12 good men and true were tradesmen of the town, whose exterior promised a variety of character and temperament, from the sharply alert to the dully unimaginative. There were other people there in whom Brent was speedily interested, and at whom he gazed with speculative attention in the opening stages of the proceedings. The court was crowded. By the time Seagrave, as coroner, took his seat, there was not a square foot of even standing space. Brent recognized a good many folk. There was Peppermore with his sharp-eyed boy assistant. There, ranged alongside of them, were many other reporters from the various county newspapers, and at least one man whom Brent recognized as being from the Press Association in London. And there was a big array of police, with Hawthwaite at its head, and there were doctors and officials of the Moot Hall, and amongst the general public many men whom Brent remembered seeing the previous day in Bull's Snug. Krevin Crood was among these; in a privileged seat not far away sat his brother the alderman, with Queenie half hidden at his side, and his satellites, Mallett and Coppinger, in close attendance. And near them, in another privileged place, sat a very pretty woman of a distinct and superior type, attired in semi-mourning and accompanied by her elderly female companion. Brent was looking at these two when Tansley nudged his elbow. "You see that handsome woman over there, next to the older one?" he whispered. "That's the Mrs. Saumarez you've heard of. that your unfortunate cousin was very friendly with. Rich young widow she is, and deuced pretty and attractive. Wallingford used to dine with her a good deal. I wonder if she's any ideas about this mystery? However, I guess we shall hear many things before the day's out, and of course I haven't the slightest notion what evidence is going to be given. But I've a pretty good idea that Seagrave means to say some pretty straight things to the jury." Here Tansley proved to be right. The Coroner, in opening the proceedings, made some forcible remarks on their unusual gravity and importance. Here was a case in which the chief magistrate of one of the most ancient boroughs in England had been found dead in his official room under circumstances which clearly seemed to point to murder. Already there were rumours in the town and neighbourhood of the darkest and most disgraceful sort: that the Mayor of Hathelsborough had been done to death, in a peculiarly brutal fashion, by a man or men who disagreed with the municipal reforms which he was intent on carrying out. It would be a lasting and indelible blot on the old town's fair fame, never tarnished before in this way, if this inquiry came to naught. If no definite verdict was given, he earnestly hoped that by the time it concluded they would be in possession of facts which would, so to speak, clear the town and any political party in the town. He begged them to give the closest attention to all that would be put before them, and to keep open minds until they heard all the available evidence. "A fairly easy matter in this particular case," muttered Tansley, as the jurymen went out to discharge their distasteful preliminary task of viewing the body of the murdered man. "I don't suppose there's a single man there who has the ghost of a theory, and I'm doubtful if he'll know much more to night than he knows now, unless something startling is sprung upon us." Brent was the first witness called into the box when the court settled down to its business. He formally identified the body of the deceased as that of his cousin, John Wallingford, at the time of his death Mayor of Hathelsborough and 41 years of age. He detailed the particulars of his own coming to the town on the evening of the murder, and told how he and Bunning, going upstairs to the Mayor's parlour, had found Wallingford lying across his desk, dead. All this every man and woman in the court knew already, but the Coroner desired to know more. "I believe, Mr. Brent," he said, when the witness had given these particulars, "that you are the deceased's nearest blood relative?" "I am," replied Dent. "Then you can give us some information which may be of use. Although the Mayor had lived in Hathelsborough some 12 years or so, he was neither a native of the town nor of these parts. Now, can you give us some particulars about him, about his family and his life before he came to this borough?" "Yes," said Brent. "My cousin was the only son, only child, in fact, of the Reverend Septimus Wallingford, who was sometime Vicar of Market Meadow in Berkshire. He is dead, many years ago; so is his wife. My cousin was educated at Reading Grammar School, and on leaving it he was articled to a firm of solicitors in that town. After qualifying as a solicitor, he remained with the firm for some time. About 12 years ago he came to this place as managing clerk to a Hathelsborough firm; its partners eventually retired, and he bought their practice." "Was he ever married?" "Never." "You knew him well?" "He was some 12 years my senior," answered Brent, "so I was a mere boy when he was a young man. But of late years we have seen a good deal of each other. He has frequently visited me in London, and this would have been my 3rd visit to him here. We corresponded regularly." "You were on good terms?" "We were on very good terms." "And confidential terms?" "As far as I know, yes. He took great interest in my work as a journalist, and I took great interest in his career in this town." "And I understand that he has marked his sense of, shall we say, kinship for you by leaving you all his property?" "He has." "Now, did he ever say anything to you, by word of mouth or letter, about any private troubles?" "No, never." "Or about any public ones?" "Well, some months ago, soon after he became Mayor of Hathelsborough, He made a sort of joking reference in a letter to something that might come under that head." "Yes? What, now?" "He said that he had started on his task of cleaning out the Augean stable of Hathelsborough, and that the old task of Hercules was child's play compared to his." "I believe, Mr. Brent, that you visited your cousin here in the town about Christmas last? Did he say anything to you about Hathelsborough at that time? I mean as regards what he called his Augean stables task?" Brent hesitated. He glanced at the eagerly listening spectators, and he smiled a little. "Well," he replied, half hesitatingly, "he did. He said that in his opinion Hathelsborough was the rottenest and most corrupt little town in all England." "Did you take that as a seriously meant statement, Mr. Brent?" "Oh, well, he laughed as he made it. I took it as a specimen of his rather heightened way of putting things." "Did he say anything that led you to think that he believed himself to have bitter enemies in the town?" "No," said Brent, "he did not." "Neither then nor at any other time?" "Neither then nor at any other time." The Coroner asked no further questions, and Brent sat down again by Tansley, and settled himself to consider whatever evidence might follow. He tried to imagine himself a coroner or juryman, and to estimate and weigh the testimony of each succeeding witness in its relation to the matter into which the court was inquiring. Some of it, he thought, was relevant, some had little in it that carried affairs any further. Yet he began to see that even the apparently irrelevant evidence was not without its importance. There were links, these statements, these answers, links that went to the making of a chain. He was already familiar with most of the evidence. He knew what each witness was likely to tell before one or other entered the box. Bunning came next after himself. Bunning had nothing new to tell, nor was there anything new in the medical evidence given by Dr. Wellesley and Dr. Barber. All the town knew how the Mayor had been murdered, and the purely scientific explanations as to the cause of death were merely details. More interest came when Hawthwaite produced the fragment of handkerchief picked up on the hearth of the Mayor's parlour, half burnt, and when he brought forward the rapier which had been discovered behind the bookcase, still more when a man who kept an old curiosity shop in a back street of the town proved that he had sold the rapier to Wallingford only a few days before the murder. But interest died down again while the Borough Surveyor produced elaborate plans and diagrams illustrating the various corridors, passages, entrances and exits of the Moot Hall, with a view to showing the difficulty of access to the Mayor's parlour. It revived once more when the policeman who had been on duty at the office in the basement stepped into the box and was questioned as to the possibilities of entrance to the Moot Hall through the door near which his desk was posted. For on pressure by the Coroner he admitted that between 6 and 8 o'clock on the fateful evening he had twice been absent from the neighbourhood of that door for intervals of 5 or 6 minutes. It was therefore possible that the murderer had slipped in and slipped out without attracting attention. This admission produced the first element of distinct sensation which had so far materialised. As almost every person present was already fairly well acquainted with the details of what had transpired on the evening of the murder, Peppermore having published every scrap of information he could rake up in successive editions of his Monitor, the constable's belated revelation came as a surprise. Hawthwaite turned on the witness with an irate, astonished look. The Coroner glanced at Hawthwaite as if he were puzzled, then looked down at certain memoranda lying before him. He turned from this to the witness, a somewhat raw, youthful policeman. "I understood that you were never away from that door between 6 and 8 o'clock on the evening in question," he said. "Now you admit that you were twice away from it?" "Yes, sir. I'm sorry, sir. I clean forgot that when the superintendent asked me at first. I was a bit flustered, like." "Now let us get a clear statement about this," said the Coroner, after a pause. "We know quite well from the plans and from our own knowledge that anyone could get up to the Mayor's parlour through the police office in the basement at the rear of the Moot Hall. What time did you go on duty at the door that opens into the office from St. Lawrence Lane?" "6 o'clock, sir." "And you were about the door, at a desk there, eh? Until when?" "Till after 8, sir." "But you say you were absent for a short time twice?" "Yes, sir, I remember now that I was." "What were the times of those two absences?" "Well, sir, about 10 minutes to 7 I went along to the charge office for a few minutes 5 or 6 minutes. Then at about 7:45 I went downstairs into the cellar to get some paraffin for a lamp. I might be away as long then, sir." "And of course during your absence anybody could have left or entered unnoticed?" "Well, they could, sir, but I don't think anybody did." "Why, now?" "Because, sir, the door opening into St. Lawrence Lane is a very heavy one, and I never heard it either open or close. The latch is a heavy one too, sir, and uncommon stiff." "Still, anybody might," observed the Coroner. "Now, what is the length of the passage between that door, the door at the foot of the stairs leading to this court, by which anybody would have to come to get that way to the Mayor's Parlour?" The witness reflected for a moment. "Well, about 10 yards, sir," he answered. The Coroner looked at the plan which the Borough Surveyor had placed before him and the jury a few minutes previously. Before he could say anything further, Hawthwaite rose from his seat, and making his way to him exchanged a few whispered remarks with him. Presently the Coroner nodded, as if in assent to some suggestion. "Oh, very well," he said. "Then perhaps we'd better have her at once. Call what's her name, did you say? Oh, yes, Sarah Jane Spizey." From amidst a heterogeneous collection of folk, men and women, congregated at the rear of the witness box, a woman came forward, one of the most extraordinary looking creatures that he had ever seen, thought Brent. She was nearly 6 feet in height, she was correspondingly built, her arms appeared to be as brawny as a navvy's, her face was of the shape and roundness of a full moon, her mouth was a wide slit, her nose a button, her eyes were as shrewd and hard as they were small and close set. A very grenadier of a woman, and apparently quite unmoved by the knowledge that everybody was staring at her. "Sarah Jane Spizey, yes. Wife of the town bellman. Resident in St. Lawrence Lane. Went out charing sometimes worked at Mariner's Laundry. Odd job woman, in fact." "Mrs. Spizey," said the Coroner, "I understand that on the evening of Mr. Wallingford's death you were engaged in some work in the Moot Hall. Is that so?" "Yes, sir. Which I was a washing the floor of this very court." "What time was that, Mrs. Spizey?" "Which I was at it, your Worshipful, from 6 o'clock to 8." "Did you leave this place at all during that time?" "Not once, sir, not for a minute." "Now, during the whole of that time, Mrs. Spizey, did you see anybody come up those stairs, cross the court, and go towards the Mayor's Parlour?" "Which I never did, sir. I never see a soul of any sort. Which the place was empty, sir, for all but me and my work, sir." The Coroner motioned Mrs. Spizey to stand down, and glanced at Hawthwaite. "I think this would be a convenient point at which to adjourn," he said. But Hawthwaite's eyes were turned elsewhere. In the body of the court an elderly man had risen. Chapter 7 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. The voluntary witness. Everybody present, not excluding Brent, knew the man at whom the Superintendent of Police was staring, and who evidently wished to address the Coroner. He was Mr. Samuel John Epplewhite, an elderly, highly respectable tradesman of the town, and closely associated with that forward party in the Town Council, of which the late Mayor had become the acknowledged leader. A man of substance and repute, who would not break in, without serious reason, upon proceedings of the sort then going on. The Coroner, following Hawthwaite's glance, nodded to him. "You wish to make some observation, Mr. Epplewhite?" he inquired. "Before you adjourn, sir, if you please," replied Epplewhite, "I should like to make a statement. Evidence, in fact, sir. I think, after what we've heard, that it's highly necessary that I should." "Certainly," answered the Coroner. "Anything you can tell, of course. Then perhaps you'll step into the witness box?" The folk who crowded the court to its very doors looked on impatiently while Epplewhite went through the legal formalities. Laying down the Testament on which he had taken the oath, he turned to the Coroner. But the Coroner again nodded to him. "You had better tell us what is in your mind in your own way, Mr. Epplewhite," he said. "We are, of course, in utter ignorance of what it is you can tell. Put it in your own fashion." Epplewhite folded his hands on the ledge of the witness box and looked around the court before finally settling his eyes on the Coroner. It seemed to Brent as if he were carefully considering the composition, severally and collectively, of his audience. "Well, sir," he began in slow, measured accents, "what I have to say, as briefly as I can, is this. Everybody here, I believe, is aware that our late Mayor and myself were on particularly friendly terms. We'd always been more or less of friends since his first coming to the town, we'd similar tastes and interests. But our friendship had been on an even more intimate basis during the last year or two, and especially of recent months, owing, no doubt, to the fact that we belonged to the same party on the Town Council, and were both equally anxious to bring about a thorough reform in municipal administration of the borough. When Mr. Wallingford was elected Mayor last November, he and I, and our supporters on the Council, resolved that during his year of office we would do our best to sweep away certain crying abuses and generally get the affairs of Hathelsborough placed on a more modern and a better footing. We were all—" The Coroner held up his hand. "Let us have a clear understanding," he said. "I am gathering, officially of course, from what you are saying, that in Hathelsborough Town Council there are two parties opposed to each other, a party pledged to reform and another that is opposed to reform. Is that so, Mr. Epplewhite?" "Precisely so," answered the witness. "And of the reform party the late Mayor was the leader. This is well known in the town it's a matter of common gossip. It is also well known to members of the Town Council that Mr. Wallingford's proposals for reform were of a very serious and drastic nature, that we of his party were going to support them through thick and thin, and that they were bitterly opposed by the other party, whose members were resolved to fight them tooth and nail." "It may be as well to know what these abuses were which you propose to reform?" suggested the Coroner. "I want to get a thorough clearing up of everything." "Well," responded the witness, with another glance around the court, "the late Mayor had a rooted and particular objection to the system of payments and pensions in force at present, which without doubt owes its existence to favouritism and jobbery. There are numerous people in the town drawing money from the borough funds who have no right to it on any ground whatever. There are others who draw salaries for what are really sinecures. A great deal of the ratepayers' money has gone in this way. Men in high places in the Corporation have used their power to benefit relations and favourites. I question if there's another town in the country in which such a state of things would be permitted. But there is a more serious matter than that, one which Mr. Wallingford was absolutely determined, with the help of his party, and backed by public opinion if he could win it over no easy thing, for we have had centuries of usage and tradition against us to bring to an end. That is the fact that the financial affairs of this town are entirely controlled by what is virtually a self-constituted body, called the Town Trustees. They are 3 in number. If one dies, the surviving 2 select his successor. Needless to say, they took good care that they choose a man who is in thorough sympathy with their own ideas. Now, the late Mayor was convinced that this system led to nothing but, well, to put it mildly, to nothing but highly undesirable results, and he claimed that the Corporation had the right to deprive the existing Town Trustees of their power, and to take into its own hands the full administration of the borough finances. And, of course, there was much bitter animosity aroused by this proposal, because the Town Trustees have had a free hand and done what they liked with the town's money for a couple of centuries." The Coroner, who was making elaborate notes, lifted his pen. "Who are the Town Trustees at present, Mr. Epplewhite?" he inquired. Epplewhite smiled, as a man might smile who knows that a question is only asked as a mere formality. "The Town Trustees at present, sir," he answered quietly, "are Mr. Alderman Crood, Deputy Mayor, Mr. Councillor Mallett, Borough Auditor, and Mr. Councillor Coppinger, Borough Treasurer." Amidst a curious silence, broken only by the scratching of the Coroner's pen, Alderman Crood rose heavily in his place amongst the spectators. "Mr. Coroner," he said, with some show of injured feeling, "I object, sir, to my name being mentioned in connection with this here matter. You're inquiring, sir?" "I'm inquiring, Mr. Crood, into the circumstances surrounding the death of John Wallingford," said the Coroner. "If you can throw any light on them, I shall be glad to take your evidence. At present I am taking the evidence of another witness. Yes, Mr. Epplewhite?" "Well, sir, I come to recent events," continued Epplewhite, smiling grimly as the Deputy Mayor, flushed and indignant, resumed his seat. "The late Mayor was very well aware that his proposals were regarded, not merely with great dislike, but with positive enmity. He, and those of us who agreed with him, were constantly asked in the Council chamber what right we had to be endeavouring to interfere with a system that had suited our fathers and grandfathers. We were warned, too, in the Council chamber that we should get ourselves into trouble." "Do you refer to actual threats?" asked the Coroner. "Scarcely that, sir. Hints and so on," replied the witness. "But of late, in the case of the late Mayor, actual threats have been used. And to bring my evidence to a point, Mr. Coroner, I now wish to make a certain statement on my oath and to produce a certain piece of evidence to show that Mr. Wallingford's personal safety was threatened only a few days before his murder." Thus saying, Epplewhite thrust a hand into the inner pocket of his coat, and producing a letter, held it out at arm's length so that every one could see it. So holding it, he turned to the Coroner. "It is just a week ago, sir," he proceeded, "that Mr. Wallingford came to supper at my house. After supper, he and I, being alone, began talking about the subject which was uppermost in our minds municipal reform. That day I had had considerable talk with 2 or 3 fellow members of the Council who belonged to the opposite party, and as a result I showed to Wallingford that opposition to our plans was growing more concentrated, determined, and bitter. He laughed a little satirically. "It's gone beyond even that stage with me, personally, Epplewhite," he said. "Don't you ever be surprised, my friend, if you hear of my being found with a bullet through my head or a knife between my ribs." "What do you mean?" said I. "Nonsense!" He laughed again and pulled out this envelope. "All right," he answered. "You read that." I read what was in the envelope, sir, and now I pass it to you. The Coroner silently took the letter which was passed across to him from the witness, withdrew a sheet of paper from it, and read the contents with an inscrutable face and amidst a dead silence. It seemed a long time before he turned to the jury. Then he held up the sheet of paper and the envelope which had contained it. "Gentlemen," he said, "I shall have to draw your particular attention to this matter. This is an anonymous letter. From the date on the postmark, it was received by the late Mayor about a week before he showed it to Mr. Epplewhite. It is a typewritten communication. The address on the envelope is typewritten, the letter itself is typewritten. I will now read the letter to you. It is as follows: Mr. Mayor, you are a young man in an old town, but you are old enough and sharp enough to take a hint. Take one now and mind your own business. What business is it of yours to interfere with good old customs in a place which you don't belong and where you're still a comparative stranger? You only got elected to the mayoral chair by 1 vote, and if you are fool enough to think that you and those behind you are strong enough to upset things, you'll find yourself wrong, for you won't be allowed. There's something a good deal stronger in this town than what you and them are, and that you'll see proved, or happen you won't see it, for if you go on as you are doing, putting your nose in where you've no right, you'll be made so that you'll never see nor hear again. Things is not going to be upset here for want of putting upsetters out of the way. There's been better men than you quietly sided for less. So take a quiet warning, leave things alone. It would become you a deal better if you'd be a bit more hospitable to the council, and give them a glass of decent wine instead of the teetotal stuff you disgraced the table with when you gave your mayoral banquet, first time any mayor of this good old borough ever did such a thing. There's them that's had quite enough of such goings-on, and doesn't mind how soon you're shifted. So mend your ways before somebody makes them, as they'll never need mending any more. Now, gentlemen," continued the coroner, as he laid down the letter, "there are one or two things about that communication to which I wish to draw your attention. First of all, it is the composition of a vulgar and illiterate, or at any rate semi-illiterate person. I don't think its phrasing and illiteracy are affected. I think it has been written in its present colloquial form, without art or design, by whoever wrote it. It is written, phrased, expressed, precisely as a vulgar, coarse sort of person would speak. That is the first point. The second is, it is typewritten. Now, in these days, there are a great many typewriting machines in use in the town. Small as the town is, we know there are a great many in offices, shops, institutions, banks, even private houses. It is not at all likely that the sender of this letter would employ a professional typist to write it, not even a clerk, nor any employee. Therefore he typed it himself. I will invite your attention to the letter, which I now hand to you, and then I will place it in the custody of the police, who will, of course, use their best endeavours to trace it." He passed the letter over to the foreman of the jury, and turned to the witness box. "I conclude, Mr. Epplewhite, that the late Mayor left that letter in your possession?" he asked. "He did, sir," replied Epplewhite. "He said, half jokingly, 'You can keep that, Epplewhite. If they sacrifice me on the altar of vested interests, it'll be a bit of evidence.' So I locked up the letter in my safe there and then, and it has remained there until this morning." "You, of course, have no idea as to the identity of the sender?" "None, sir." "Had Mr. Wallingford?" "Neither of us, sir, formed any conclusion, but we both thought that the letter emanated from some member of the Opposition." "Did Mr. Wallingford take it as a serious threat?" Epplewhite looked doubtful. "I scarcely know," he said. "He seemed half-minded about it. To regard it, you know, as half a joke and half serious. But I feel certain that he knew he had enemies who might become well, deadly. That's my distinct impression, Mr. Coroner." The typewritten letter went its round of the jury, and presently came back to the Coroner. He replaced it in its envelope and handed the envelope to Hawthwaite. "You must leave no stone unturned in your effort to trace that letter to its source," he said. "That's of the highest importance. And now I think we had better adjourn for—" But Tansley rose from his seat at Brent's elbow. "I should like to draw attention to a somewhat pertinent fact, Mr. Coroner," he said. "It seems to have a distinct bearing on what has just transpired. During a search of the deceased's private papers, made by Mr. Brent and myself yesterday afternoon, we found Mr. Wallingford's will. It was drawn up by himself in very concise terms, and duly executed only a few days before his death. It suggests itself to me that he was impelled to this by the threat which is distinctly made in the letter you have just read." "I think we may take it that the late Mayor felt that he was in some personal danger," answered the Coroner. "What you say, Mr. Tansley, appears to corroborate that." Then, with a few words of counsel to the jury, he adjourned the inquest for 10 days, and presently the folk who had listened to the proceedings streamed out into the market place, excited and voluble. Instead of going away, the greater number of those who had been present lingered around the entrance, and Brent, leaving in Tansley's company a few minutes later, found high words being spoken between Alderman Crood and Epplewhite, who, prominent on the pavement, were haranguing each other amidst a ring of open-mouthed bystanders. "You were at that game all through what you called your evidence," vociferated Alderman Crood, who was obviously excited and angry far beyond his wont. "Nice evidence, indeed! Naught is it but trying to fasten blame on to innocent folk." "Suggesting!" sneered Mallett, close on his leader's right elbow. "Insinuating!" "Hinting at things," said Coppinger, close on the left. "Implying!" "Dirty work!" shouted Alderman Crood. "Such as nobody but the likes o' you, Radicals and teetotallers and chapel folk, 'ud ever think o' doing. You say straight out before the town what's in your mind, Sam Epplewhite, and I'll see what the law has to say to you. I'm none going to have my character taken away by a fellow o' your sort. Say your say here in public?" "I'll say my say at the right time and place, Alderman Crood," retorted Epplewhite. "This thing's going through. We'll find out who murdered John Wallingford yet. There's no need to go far away to find the murderer." Crood's big face grew livid with anger, and his long upper lip began to quiver. He raised his hand as if to command the attention of the crowd, but just then Hawthwaite and a couple of policemen appeared at the open doorway behind, and Mallett and Coppinger, nudging the big man from either side, led him away along the market-place. And suddenly, from amongst the dispersing crowd, distinct murmurs of disapproval and dislike arose, crystallized in a sharp cry from some man on its outer edge. "Down with the Town Trustees! They're at the bottom of this! Down with 'em!" The Town Trustees retreated before a suddenly awakened chorus of hooting. They disappeared into Mallett's private door at the bank. Brent, watching and listening with speculative curiosity, felt Tansley touch his arm. He turned to find the solicitor shaking his head, and with a grave countenance. "Bad, bad!" muttered Tansley. "Very bad! Once get public opinion set on like that, and " "And what?" demanded Brent. He was already so convinced that his cousin had fallen a victim to political hatred that he was rather welcoming the revengeful outburst of feeling. "What now?" "There'll be an end of all sensible and practical proceedings in connection with the affair," answered Tansley. "There's a big following of the Reform party in the town amongst the working folk, and if they once get it into their heads that the Conservative lot put your cousin away, well, there'll be hell to pay." "Personally," said Brent, with a hardening of his square jaw, "I don't care if there is. If we can only put our hands on the murderers, I don't care if the people hang 'em to those lamp posts. I shouldn't be sorry to see a little lynch law." "Then we shall never get at the truth," retorted Tansley. "We may only may, mind you have got a bit towards it this morning, but not far. If at all, perhaps." "That threatening letter?" suggested Brent. "I attach very little importance to it," said Tansley, "though I wasn't going to say so much in court. In my experience in this town, if I've seen one anonymous letter, I've seen 100. Hathelsborough folk are given to that sort of thing. No, sir, there's a tremendous lot to come out yet. Don't you be surprised if all sorts of extraordinary developments materialise, perhaps when you're least expecting 'em." Brent made no answer. He was not easily surprised, and from the moment of his discovery of the crime he had realized that this was a mystery in the unravelling of which time and trouble would have to be expended freely. But he had a moment of genuine surprise that evening when, as he sat in his private sitting room at the Chancellor, he received a note, written in a delicate feminine hand on crested and scented paper, wherein he was requested, in somewhat guarded and mysterious fashion, to step round to the private residence of Mrs. Saumarez. Chapter 8 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. Mrs. Saumarez. Brent, at that moment, was in a state of mind which made every fibre of his being particularly sensitive to suspicions and speculative ideas. He had no sooner slipped Mrs. Saumarez's note into his pocket than he began to wonder why she had sent for him. Of course it had something to do with Wallingford's murder. But what? If Mrs. Saumarez knew anything, why did she not speak at the inquest? She had been present all through the proceedings. Brent had frequently turned his eyes on her. Always he had seen her in the same watchful, keen-eyed attitude, apparently deeply absorbed in the evidence and, it seemed to him, showing signs of a certain amount of anxiety. Anxiety, yes, that was it, anxiety. The other spectators were curious, morbidly curious, most of them, but Mrs. Saumarez, he felt sure, was anxious. And about what? He wondered, but wondering was no good. He must go and see her, of course, and presently he made himself ready and set out. But as he crossed the hall of the hotel he encountered Tansley, who was just emerging from the smoking room. A thought occurred to him, and he motioned Tansley back into the room he had just quitted and led him to a quiet corner. "I say," said Brent, "between ourselves, I've just had a note from that Mrs. Saumarez we saw this morning in the Coroner's Court. She wants me to go round to her house at once." Tansley showed his interest. "Ah!" he exclaimed. "Then she's something to tell." "Why to me?" demanded Brent. "You're Wallingford's next of kin," said the solicitor laconically. "That's why." "Wonder what it is?" muttered Brent. "Some feminine fancy, maybe?" "Go and find out, man!" laughed Tansley. "Just so," replied Brent. "I'm going now. But look here, who and what is this Mrs. Saumarez? Post me up." Tansley waved his cigar in the air, as if implying that you could draw a circle around his field of knowledge. "Oh, well," he said, "you saw her to day. So you're already aware that she's young and pretty and charming and all that. As for the rest, she's a widow, and a wealthy one. Relict, as we say in the law, of a naval officer of high rank, who I fancy was some years older than herself. She came here about 2 years ago and rents a picturesque old place that was built, long since, out of the ruins of the old Benedictine abbey that used to stand at the rear of what's now called Abbey Gate. Some of the ruins, as you know, are still there. Clever woman, reads a lot and all that sort of thing. Not at all a society woman, in spite of her prettiness. Bit of a blue-stocking, I fancy. Scarcely know her myself." "I think you said my cousin knew her?" suggested Brent. "Your cousin and she, latterly, were very thick," asserted Tansley. "He spent a lot of time at her house. During nearly all last summer and winter, though, she was away in the south of France. Oh, yes, Wallingford often went to dine with her. She has a companion who lives with her, that elderly woman we saw this morning. Yes, I suppose Wallingford went there, 2 or 3 evenings a week. In fact, there were people, gossipers, who firmly believed that he and Mrs. Saumarez were going to make a match of it. Might be so, but up to about the end of last summer the same people used to say that she was going to marry the doctor, Wellesley." Brent pricked his ears. He scarcely knew why. "Wellesley?" he said. "What, was he a suitor?" "Oh, well," answered Tansley, "I think the lady's one of the sort that's much fonder of men's society than of women's, you know. Anyway, after she came here, she and Wellesley seemed to take to each other, and she used to be in his company a good deal, used to go out driving with him a lot, and so on. And he used to go to the Abbey House at that time just as much as your cousin did of late. But about the end of last summer, Mrs. Saumarez seemed to cool off with Wellesley and take on with Wallingford. Fact. The doctor got his nose put out by the lawyer. There's no doubt about it, and there's no doubt either that the result was a distinct coolness, not to say dislike, between Wellesley and Wallingford, for up to then those two had been rather close friends. But they certainly weren't after Mrs. Saumarez plainly showed a preference for Wallingford. Yet in spite of that," continued Tansley, as if some afterthought struck him, "I'll say this for Wellesley. He's never allowed his undoubted jealousy of Wallingford to prevent him from supporting Wallingford on the Town Council. Wellesley, indeed, has always been one of his staunchest and most consistent supporters." "Oh, Dr. Wellesley's on the Town Council, is he?" asked Brent. And a Reform man?" "He's councillor for the Riverside Ward," answered Tansley, "and a regular Radical. In fact, he, Wallingford, and that chap Epplewhite were the three recognised leaders of the Reform party. Yes, Wellesley stuck to Wallingford as leader even when it became pretty evident that Wallingford had ousted him in Mrs. Saumarez's affections. Fact." "Affections, eh?" surmised Brent. "You think it had come to as much as that?" "I do!" affirmed Tansley. "Lord bless you, she and Wallingford were as thick as thieves, as our local saying goes. Oh, yes, I'm sure she threw Wellesley over for Wallingford." Brent heard all this in silence, and remained for a time in further silence. He remarked at last. "Odd! Mrs. Saumarez is an unusually pretty woman. Dr. Wellesley is a very handsome man. Now, my cousin was about as plain and insignificant a chap to look at as ever I came across, poor fellow." "Your cousin was a damned clever chap," said Tansley incisively. "He'd got brains, my dear sir, and where women cleverish women, anyhow are concerned, brains are going to win all the way, and come in winners by as many lengths as you please. Mrs. Saumarez, I understand, is a woman who dabbles in politics, and your cousin interested her. And when a woman gets deeply interested in a man " "I guess you're right," assented Brent. "Well, I'll step along and see her." He left Tansley in the hotel, and went away along the market place, wondering a good deal about the information just given to him. So there was a coolness between his cousin and Wellesley, was there? A coolness that amounted, said Tansley, to something stronger? Did it amount to jealousy? Did the jealousy lead to But at that point Brent gave up speculating. If there was anything in this new suggestion, Mrs. Saumarez would hold the key. Once more he was face to face with the fact that had steadily obtruded itself upon him during the last 2 days, that here, in this time-worn old place, there were folks who had secrets and did things in a curiously secret fashion. Mrs. Saumarez's house stood a little way back from the street called Abbey Gate, an old, apparently early Jacobean mansion, set amidst the elms for which Hathelsborough was famous, so profusely and to such a height did they grow all over the town. A smart parlour maid, who looked inquisitively at him, and was evidently expecting his arrival, admitted Brent, and led him at once along a half-lighted hall into a little room where the light of a shaded lamp shone on a snug and comfortable interior, and on rows of more books than any young and pretty women generally possess. Left alone for a few minutes, Brent glanced around the well-filled shelves, and formed the opinion that Mrs. Saumarez went in for very solid reading, chiefly in the way of social and political economy. He began to see now why she and the murdered Mayor had been such close friends. The subjects that apparently interested her had been those in which Wallingford had always been deeply absorbed. Maybe, then, Mrs. Saumarez had been behind the Reform party in Hathelsborough? There was a woman wire puller at the back of these matters as a rule, he believed. That sort of thing, perhaps, was Mrs. Saumarez's little hobby. He turned from these speculations to find her at his elbow. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Brent," she said softly. Brent looked attentively at her as he took the hand which she held out to him. Seen at closer quarters, he saw that she was a much prettier woman than he had fancied. He saw, too, that whatever her tastes might be in the way of politics and sociology, she was wholly feminine, and not above enhancing her charms by punctilious attention to her general appearance and setting. She had been very quietly and even sombrely dressed at the inquest that morning, but she was now in evening dress, and her smart gown, her wealth of fair hair, her violet eyes, and the rose tint of her little cheek somewhat dazzled Brent, who was not greatly used to women's society. He felt a little shy and a little awkward. Yes, I came at once," he said. Of course I gathered that you wanted me." Mrs. Saumarez smiled, and pointing to an easy chair in front of the bright fire, dropped into another close by it. "Sit down, Mr. Brent," she said. "Yes, I wanted you, and I couldn't very well go to the Chancellor, could I? So thank you again for coming so promptly. Perhaps," she turned and looked at him steadily, "you're already aware that your cousin and I were great friends?" "I've heard it," answered Brent. He nodded at one of the bookcases at which she had found him looking. "Similar tastes, I suppose? He was a great hand at that sort of thing." "Yes," she said. "We had a good deal in common. I was much interested in all his plans, and so on. He was a very clever man, a deeply interesting man, and I have felt more than I'm going to say. But I think I'd better tell you why I sent for you." "Yes," assented Brent. "I gathered from what was said at the inquest this morning that you are your cousin's sole executor?" she asked. "I am," replied Brent. "Sole everything." "Then, of course, you have entire charge and custody of his papers?" she suggested. "That's so," answered Brent. "Everything's in my possession." Mrs. Saumarez sighed gently. It seemed to Brent that there was something of relief in the sigh. "Last autumn and winter," she continued presently, "I was away from home a long time. I was in the south of France. Mr. Wallingford and I kept up a regular and frequent correspondence. It was just then, you know, that he became Mayor, and began to formulate his schemes for the regeneration of this rotten little town." "You think it's that, eh?" interrupted Brent, emphasising the personal pronoun. "That's your conviction?" Mrs. Saumarez's violet eyes flashed, and a queer little smile played for a second time round the corner of her pretty lips. "Rotten to the core!" she said quietly. "Ripe rotten! He knew it knew more than he ever let anyone know." "More than he ever let you know?" asked Brent. "I knew a good deal," she replied evasively. "But this correspondence we wrote to each other twice a week all the time I was away. I have all his letters there, in that safe." "Yes?" said Brent. Mrs. Saumarez looked down at the slim fingers which lay in her lap. "He kept all mine," she continued. "Yes?" repeated Brent. "I want them," she murmured, with a sudden lifting of her eyelids in her visitor's direction. "I don't want them to fall into anybody else's hands. You understand, Mr. Brent?" "You want me to find them?" suggested Brent. "Not to find them that is, not to search for them," she replied quickly. "I know where they are. I want you, if you please, to give them back to me." "Where are they?" asked Brent. "He told me where he kept them," answered Mrs. Saumarez. "They are in a cedarwood cabinet in a drawer in his bedroom." "All right," said Brent. "I'll get them." Was he mistaken in thinking that it was an unmistakable sigh of relief that left Mrs. Saumarez's delicate red lips, and that an additional little flush of colour came into her cheeks? But her voice was calm and even enough. "Thank you," she said. "So good of you! Of course they aren't of the faintest interest to anybody. I can have them, then when?" Brent rose to his feet. "When I was taught my business," he said with a dry smile, "I'd a motto drummed into my head, day in and day out: Do it now! So I guess I'll just go round to my cousin's old rooms and get you that cabinet at once." Mrs. Saumarez smiled. It was a smile that would have thrilled most men. But Brent merely got a deepened impression of her prettiness. "I like your way of doing things," she said. "That's business. You ought to stop here, Mr. Brent, and take up your cousin's work." "It would be a fitting tribute to his memory, wouldn't it?" answered Brent. "Well, I don't know. But this letter business is a thing to do now. I'll be back in 10 minutes, Mrs. Saumarez." "Let yourself in, and come straight here," she said. "I'll wait for you." Wallingford's old rooms were close at hand only round the corner, in fact, and Brent went straight to them and into the bedroom. He found the cedar cabinet at once. He had, in fact, seen it the day before, but finding it locked had made no attempt to open it. He carried it back to Mrs. Saumarez, set it on her desk and laid beside it a bunch of keys. "I suppose you'll find this key amongst those," he said. "They're all the private keys of his that I have, anyway." "Perhaps you will find it?" she suggested. "I'm a bad hand at that sort of thing." Brent had little difficulty in finding the right key. Unthinkingly he raised the lid of the cabinet and quickly closed it again. In that momentary glimpse of the contents it seemed to him that he had unearthed a dead man's secret. For in addition to a pile of letters he had seen a woman's glove, a knot of ribbon, some faded flowers. "That's it," he said hurriedly, shutting down the lid and affecting to have seen nothing. "I'll take the key off the bunch." Mrs. Saumarez took the key from him in silence, relocked the cabinet and carried it over to a safe let into the wall of the room. "Thank you, Mr. Brent," she said. "I'm glad to have those letters." Brent made as if to leave, but he suddenly turned on her. "You know a lot," he remarked brusquely. "What's your opinion about my cousin's murder?" Mrs. Saumarez remained silent so long that he spoke again. "Do you think, from what you've seen of things in this town, that it was what we may call political?" he asked. "A removal?" He was watching her closely, and he saw the violet eyes grow sombre and a certain hardness settle about the lines of the well shaped mouth and chin. "It's this," she said suddenly. "I told you just now that this town is rotten and corrupt as so many of these little old world English boroughs are. He knew it, poor fellow he's steadily been finding it out ever since he came here. I dare say you, coming from London, a great city, wouldn't understand. But it's this way. This town is run by a gang, the members of which manoeuvre everything for their own and their friends' benefit, their friends and their hangers-on, their associates, their toadies. Do you mean the Town Trustees?" asked Brent. "Not wholly," replied Mrs. Saumarez. "But all that Epplewhite said to day about the Town Trustees is true. The three men control the financial affairs of the borough. Wallingford, by long and patient investigation, had come to know how they controlled them, and how utterly corrupt and rotten the whole financial administration is. If you could see some of the letters of his which I have in that safe." "Wouldn't it be well to produce them?" suggested Brent. "Not yet, anyway," she said. "I'll consider that. Much of it's general statement, not particular accusation. But the Town Trustees question is not all. Until very recently, when a reform party gradually got into being and increased steadily, though it's still in a minority, the whole representation and administration of the borough was hopelessly bad and unprincipled. For what do you suppose men went into the Town Council? To represent the ratepayer, the townspeople? No, but to look after their own interests, to safeguard themselves, to get what they could out of it. The whole policy of the old councils was one of there's only one word for it, Mr. Brent, and that's only just becoming anglicised graft. Now, the corporation of a town is supposed to exist for the good, the welfare, the protection of a town, but the whole idea of these Hathelsborough men, in the past, has been to use their power and privileges as administrators for their own ends. So here you've had, on the one hand, the unfortunate ratepayer, and on the other, a close corporation, a privileged band of pirates, battening on them. In plain words, there are about 100 men in Hathelsborough who have used the 7,000 or 8,000 other folk as a means to their own ends. The town has been a helpless, defenceless thing, from which these harpies have picked whatever they could lay their talons on." "That's the conclusion he'd come to?" asked Brent. "He couldn't have come to any other after many years of patient investigation," declared Mrs. Saumarez. "And he was the sort of man who had an inborn hatred of abuses and shams and hypocrisy. And now, put it to yourself. When a man stands up against vested interests, such as exist here, and says plainly that he's never going to rest, nor leave a stone unturned, until he's made a radical and thorough reformation, do you think he's going to have a primrose path of it? Bah! But he knew his danger." "But murder!" said Brent. "Murder!" Mrs. Saumarez shook her head. "Yes," she answered. "But there are men in this place who wouldn't stick at even that. You don't know. If Wallingford had done all the things he'd vowed to do, there would have been such an exposure of affairs here as would have made the whole country agape. And some men would have been ruined, literally. I know. And things will come out and be tracked down if no red herrings are drawn across the trail. You're going to get at the truth?" "By God, yes!" exclaimed Brent with sudden fervour. "I am so." "Look for his murderers amongst the men he intended to show up, then," she said with a certain fierce intensity. "And look closely and secretly. There's no other way." Brent presently left her and went off wondering about the contents of the little cabinet. He would have wondered still more if he had been able to look back into the cosy room which he had just left. For when he had gone, Mrs. Saumarez took the cabinet from the safe and carefully emptied the whole of its contents into the glowing heart of the fire. She stood watching as the flames flicked round them, and until there was nothing left but black ash. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. The right to intervene. Brent went back to his hotel to find the Town Clerk of Hathelsborough waiting for him in his private sitting room. His visitor, a sharp-eyed man whose profession was suggested in every look and movement, greeted him with a suavity of manner which set Brent on his guard. "I am here, Mr. Brent," he said, with an almost deprecating smile, as a sort of informal deputation. Informal." "Deputations represent somebody or something," retorted Brent, in his brusquest fashion. "Whom do you represent?" "The borough authorities," replied the Town Clerk, with another smile. "That is to say—" "You'll excuse me for interrupting," said Brent. "I'm a man of plain speech. I take it that by borough authorities you mean, say, Mr. Simon Crood and his fellow Town Trustees? That so?" "Well, perhaps so," admitted the Town Clerk. "Mr. Alderman Crood, to be sure, is Deputy Mayor, and he and his brother Town Trustees are certainly men of authority." "What do you want?" demanded Brent. The Town Clerk lowered his voice, quite unnecessarily in Brent's opinion. His suave tones became dulcet and mollifying. "My dear sir," he said, leaning forward, "to-morrow you have the sad task of interring your cousin, our late greatly respected Mayor." "Going to bury him to-morrow," responded Brent. "Just so. Well?" "There is a rumour in the town that you intend the ceremony to be absolutely private," continued the Town Clerk. "I do," assented Brent, "and it will be." The Town Clerk made a little expostulatory sound. "My dear sir," he said soothingly, "the late Mr. Wallingford was Mayor of Hathelsborough. The 481st Mayor of Hathelsborough, Mr. Brent." Brent, who was leaning against the mantelpiece, looked fixedly at his visitor. "Supposing he was the 999th Mayor of Hathelsborough?" he asked quietly. "What then?" "He should have a public funeral," declared the Town Clerk promptly. "My dear sir, to inter a Mayor of Hathelsborough, and the 481st holder of the ancient and most dignified office, privately, as if he were a mere nobody, a common townsman, really, it's unheard of." "That the notion of the men who sent you here?" asked Brent grimly. "The notion, as you call it, of the gentlemen who sent me here, Mr. Brent, is that your cousin's funeral obsequies should be of a public nature," answered the Town Clerk. "According to precedent, of course. During my term of office as Town Clerk, 2 mayors have died during their year of mayoralty. On such occasions the Corporation has been present in state." "In state?" said Brent. "What does that amount to? Sort of procession?" "A duly marshalled one," answered the Town Clerk. "The beadle, with his mace, the Deputy Mayor, the Recorder and Town Clerk, of course, in wigs and gowns, the aldermen in their furred robes, the councillors in their violet gowns, a very stately procession, Mr. Brent, preceding the funeral cortège to St. Hathelswide's Church, where the vicar, as Mayor's chaplain, would deliver a funeral oration. The procession would return subsequently to the Moot Hall for wine and cake." Brent rubbed his square chin, staring hard at his visitor. He said at last. Well, there isn't going to be anything of that sort to-morrow. I'm just going to bury my cousin quietly and privately, without maces and furred robes and violet gowns. So you can just tell him, politely, nothing doing." "But, my dear sir, my good Mr. Brent," expostulated the visitor, "the Mayor of Hathelsborough, the oldest borough in the country! Why, our Charter of Incorporation dates from—" "I'm not particularly interested in archaeology, just now, anyway," interrupted Brent. "And it's nothing to me in connection with this matter if your old charter was signed by William the Conqueror or Edward the Confessor. I say, nothing doing." "But your reasons, my dear sir, your reasons!" exclaimed the Town Clerk. "Such a breaking with established custom and precedent! I really don't know what the neighbouring boroughs will say of us." "Let 'em say," retorted Brent. He laughed contemptuously. But suddenly his mood changed, and he turned on his visitor with what the Town Clerk afterwards described as a very ugly look. "But if you want to know," he added, "I'll tell you why I won't have any corporation processing after my cousin's dead body. It's because I believe that his murderer's one of 'em. See?" The Town Clerk, a rosy-cheeked man, turned pale. His gloves lay on the table at his elbow, and his fingers trembled a little as he picked them up and began fitting them on with meticulous precision. "My dear sir," he said, in a tone that suggested his profession more strongly than ever, "that's very grave language. As a solicitor, I should advise you—" "When I say murderer," continued Brent, "I'm perhaps wrong. I might, and no doubt ought to, use the plural. Murderers. I believe that more than one of your rascally corporation conspired to murder my cousin. And I'm going to have no blood-stained hypocrites processing after his coffin. You tell 'em to keep away." "I had better withdraw," said the Town Clerk. "No hurry," observed Brent, changing to geniality. He laid his hand on the bell. "Have a whisky and soda and a cigar. We've finished our business, and I guess you're a man as well as a lawyer?" But the visitor was unable to disassociate his personal identity from his office, and he bowed himself out. Brent laughed when he had gone. "Got the weight of 481 years of incorporation on him," he said. "Lord! It's like living with generation after generation of your grandfathers slung round you. 481 years! Must have been in the bad old days when this mouldy town got its charter." Next morning Brent buried the dead Mayor in St. Hathelswide's churchyard, privately and quietly. He stayed by the grave until the sexton and his assistants had laid the green turf over it. That done, he went round to the Abbey House and sought out Mrs. Saumarez. After his characteristic fashion, he spoke out what was in his mind. "I've pretty well fixed up in myself to do what you suggested last night," he said, giving her one of his direct glances. "You know what I mean, to go on with his work." Mrs. Saumarez's eyes sparkled. "That would be splendid!" she exclaimed. "But if he had opposition, you'll have it 100-fold. You're not afraid?" "Afraid of nothing," said Brent carelessly. "But I just don't know how I'd get any right to do it. I'm not a townsman. I've no locus standi. But then he wasn't, to begin with." "I'd forgotten that," said Mrs. Saumarez. "And you'd have to give up your work in London. Journalism, isn't it?" "I've thought of that," said Brent. "Well, I've had a pretty good spell at it, and I'm not so keen about keeping on it any longer. There's other work, literary work, I'd prefer. And I'm not dependent on it anyway. I've got means of my own, and now Wallingford's left me a good lot of money. No, I guess I wouldn't mind coming here and going on with the job he'd set himself to. I'd like to do it. But then how to get a footing in the place?" Mrs. Saumarez considered for a while. Suddenly her face lighted up. "You've got money," she said. "Why don't you buy a bit of property in the town? A piece of real estate, then—" Brent picked up his hat. "That's a good notion," he said. "I'll step round and see Tansley about it." Tansley had been one of the very few men whom Brent had invited to be present at his cousin's interment. He had just changed his mourning garments for those of everyday life, and was settling down to his professional business when Brent was shown into his private office. "Busy?" demanded Brent, in his usual laconic fashion. "Give you whatever time you want," answered the solicitor, who knew his man by that time. "What is it now?" "I've concluded to take up my abode in this old town," said Brent, with something of a sheepish smile. "Seems queer, no doubt, but my mind's fixed. And so, look here, you don't know anybody that's got a bit of real estate to sell? Nice little house, or something of that sort? If so—" Tansley thrust his letters and papers aside, pushed an open box of cigars in his visitor's direction, and lighting one himself, became inquisitively attentive. "What's the game?" he asked. Brent lighted a cigar and took 2 or 3 meditative puffs at it before answering this direct question. "Well," he said at last, "I don't think that I'm a particularly sentimental sort of person, but all the same I'm not storm-proof against sentiment, and I've just got the conviction that it's up to me to go on with my cousin's job in this place." Tansley took his cigar from his lips and whistled. "Tall order, Brent," he remarked. "So I reckon," assented Brent, "but I've served an apprenticeship to that sort of thing, and I've always gone through with whatever came my way." "Let's be plain," said Tansley. "You mean that you want to settle here in the town and go on with Wallingford's reform policy?" "That's just it," replied Brent. "You've got it." "All I can say is, then, that you're rendering yourself up to, well, not envy, but certainly to hatred, malice, and all uncharitableness, as it's phrased in the prayer book," declared Tansley. "You'll have a hot old time." "Used to 'em," retorted Brent. "You forget I've been a pressman for some years." "But you didn't get that sort of thing?" suggested Tansley, half incredulous. Brent flicked the ash from his cigar and smiled. "Don't go in for tall talk," he said lazily, "but it was I who tracked down the defaulting directors of the great Combined Amalgamation affair, and ran to earth that chap who murdered his ward away up in Northumberland, and found the Pembury absconding bank manager who'd scooted off so cleverly that the detectives couldn't trace even a smile of him. Pretty stiff propositions, all those, and I reckon I can do my bit here in this place, on Wallingford's lines, if I can get the right to intervene as a townsman. That's just what I want. Locus standi." "And when you've got it?" asked Tansley. Brent worked his cigar into the corner of his firm lips, and folding his arms stared straight in front of him. "Well," he said slowly, "I think I've fixed that in my own mind. Fixed it all out while the parson was putting him away in that old churchyard this morning. I was thinking hard while he was reading his book. I understand that by my cousin's death there's a vacancy in the Town Council. He sat for some ward or other?" "He sat for the Castle ward as Town Councillor," assented Tansley. "So of course there's a vacancy." "Well," continued Brent, "I reckon I'll put up for that vacancy. I'll be Mr. Councillor Richard Brent." "You're a stranger, man," laughed Tansley. "I'll not be in a week's time," retorted Brent. "I'll be known to every householder in that ward. But this locus standi? If I bought real estate in the town, I'd be a townsman, wouldn't I? A burgess, I reckon. And then, why, legally I'd be as much a Hathelsborough man as, say, Simon Crood." Tansley took his hands out of his pockets and began to search amongst his papers. "Well, you're a go-ahead chap, Brent," he said. "Evidently not the sort to let grass grow under your feet. And if you want to buy a bit of nice property, I've the very goods for you. There's a client of mine, John Chillingham, a retired tradesman, who wants to sell his house. He's desirous of quitting this part of the country and going to live on the south coast. It's a delightful bit of property, just at the back of the castle, and it's therefore in the Castle ward. Acacia Lodge it's called. Nice, roomy, old-fashioned house, in splendid condition, modernized, set in a beautiful old garden, with a magnificent cedar tree on the lawn, and a fine view from its front windows, and, for a quick sale, cheap." "What's the figure?" asked Brent. 2,000 guineas, answered Tansley. Brent reached for his hat. "Let's go and look at it," he said. Within a few hours Brent had settled his purchase of Acacia Lodge from the retired tradesman, and Tansley was busy with the legal necessities of the conveyance. That done, and in his new character of townsman and property owner, Brent sought out Peppermore, and into that worthy's itching and astonished ears poured out a confession which the editor of the Monitor was to keep secret until the next day, after which, retiring to his sitting room at the Chancellor, he took up pen and paper and proceeded to write a document which occasioned him more thought than he usually gave to his literary productions. It was not a lengthy document, but it had been rewritten and interlineated and corrected several times before Brent carried it to the Monitor office and the printing press. Peppermore, reading it over, grinned with malicious satisfaction. "That'll make 'em open their mouths and their eyes to-morrow morning, Mr. Brent!" he exclaimed. "We'll have it posted all over the town by 10 o'clock, sir. Powerful organ, Mr. Brent, very powerful organ. Can do on your behalf and in your interest, shall be done, sir, it shall be done, con amore, as I believe they say in Italy." "Thank'ee," said Brent. "You're the right stuff." "Don't mention it, sir," replied Peppermore. "Only too pleased. Egad, I wish I could see Mr. Alderman Crood's face when he reads this poster." At 10 next morning, as he, Mallett and Coppinger came together out of the side door of the bank, where they had been in close conference since 9:30 on affairs of their own, Mr. Alderman Crood saw the poster on which was set out Brent's election address to the voters of the Castle Ward. The bill-posting people had pasted a copy of it on a blank wall opposite. The three men, open-mouthed and wide-eyed, gathered round and read. Crood grew purple with anger. "Impudence!" he exclaimed at last. "Sheer, brazen impudence! Him, a stranger! Take up his cousin's work, will he? And what's he mean by saying that he's now a Hathelsborough man?" "I heard about that last night," answered Coppinger. "Tansley told two or three of us at the club. This fellow Brent has bought that property of old Chillingham's, Acacia Lodge. Freehold, you know, bought it right out. He's a Hathelsborough man now, right enough." Then they both turned and glanced at Mallett, who was re-reading Brent's election address with brooding eyes and lowering brow. "Well?" demanded Coppinger. "What do you make out of it, Mallett?" Mallett removed his glasses and sniffed. "Don't let's deceive ourselves," he said, with a hasty glance round. "This chap's out to make trouble. He's no fool, either. If he gets into the council, we shall have an implacable enemy. And he's every chance. So it's all the more necessary than ever that we should bring off to-morrow what we've been talking about this morning." "We ought to do that," said Coppinger. "We can count on 14 sure votes." "Aye," said Mallett. "But so can they. The thing is, the 3 votes neither party can count on. We must get at those 3 men to-day. If we don't carry our point to-morrow, we shall have Sam Epplewhite or Dr. Wellesley as mayor, and things'll be as bad as they were under Wallingford." This conversation referred to an extraordinary meeting of the Town Council which had been convened for the next day in order to elect a new mayor of Hathelsborough in succession to John Wallingford, deceased. Brent heard of it that afternoon from Queenie Crood in the Castle grounds. He had met Queenie there more than once since their first encountering in those sheltered nooks. Already he was not quite sure that he was not looking forward with increasing pleasure to these meetings. For with each Queenie came further out of her shell, the more they met, the more she let him see of herself, and he found her interesting. And they had given up talking of Queenie's stage ambitions, not that she had thrown them over, but that she and Brent had begun to find the discussion of their own personalities more to the immediate point than the canvassing of remote possibilities. Each, in fact, was in the stage of finding each other a mine worth exploring. Brent began to see a lot in Queenie and her dark eyes. Queenie was beginning to consider Brent, with his grim jaw, his brusque off-hand speech and masterful manner, a curiously fascinating person. Besides, he was beginning to do things that only strong men do. "You're in high disgrace at the Tannery House," she remarked archly, when they met that afternoon. "I should think your ears must have burned this dinner time." "Why now?" inquired Brent. "Uncle Simon brought Mallett and Coppinger home to dinner," continued Queenie. "It was lucky there was a big hot joint they're all great eaters and drinkers. And they abused you to their heart's content. This Town Council business, they say it's infernal impudence for you to put up for election. However, Coppinger says you'll not get in." "Coppinger is a bad prophet," said Brent. "I'll be Town Councillor in a fortnight. Lay anybody 10-1. "Well, they'll do everything they can to keep you out," declared Queenie. "You've got to fight an awful lot of opposition." "Let 'em all come," retorted Brent. "I'll represent the Castle Ward, and now that I'm a burgess of Hathelsborough, I'll be Mayor some old time." "Not yet, though," said Queenie. "They're going to elect a new Mayor to morrow. In place of your cousin, of course." Brent started. Nobody had mentioned that to him. Yet he might have thought of it himself. Of course there must be a new Mayor of Hathelsborough. "Gad, I hope it'll not be one of the old gang," he muttered. "If it is—" But by noon next day he heard that the old gang had triumphed. Mr. Alderman Crood was elected Mayor of Hathelsborough by a majority of 2 votes. A couple of the wobblers on the council had given way at the last moment and thrown in their lot with the reactionary let things alone party. "Never mind, I'll win my election," said Brent. "The future is with me." He set to work in strenuous fashion to enlist the favours of the Castle Ward electorate. All day, from early morning until late at night, he was cultivating the acquaintance of the burgesses. He had little time for any other business than this. There were but 10 days before the election. But now and then he visited the police station and interviewed Hawthwaite, and at each visit he found the superintendent becoming increasingly reserved and mysterious in manner. Hawthwaite would say nothing definite, but he dropped queer hints about certain things that he had up his sleeve to be duly produced at the adjourned inquest. As to what they were, he remained resolutely silent, even to Brent. Chapter 10. of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. The Cat in the Bag. But as the day of the adjourned inquest drew near, Brent became aware that there were rumours in the air, rumours of some sensational development, the particulars of which were either non-obtainable or utterly vague. He heard of them from Peppermore, whose journalistic itching for news had so far gone unrelieved. Peppermore himself knew no more than that rumour was busy and secret. "Can't make out for the life of me what it is, Mr. Brent," said Peppermore, calling upon Brent at the Chancellor on the eve of the inquiry. "But there's something, sir, something. You know that boy of mine, young Pryder?" "Smart youth," replied Brent. "As they make 'em, sir," agreed Peppermore. "That boy, Mr. Brent, will go far in the profession of which you're a shining and I'm a dim light. He's got what the French, I believe, sir, call a flair for news. Took to our line like a duck to water, Mr. Brent. Well, now, young Pryder's father is a policeman, sergeant in the borough constabulary, and naturally he's opportunities of knowing. And when he knows, he talks in the home circle, Mr. Brent." "Been talking?" asked Brent. "Guardedly, sir, guardedly," replied Peppermore. "Young Pryder, he told me this afternoon that his father, when he came home to dinner to day, said to him and his mother that when the inquest's reopened to morrow there'd be something to talk about. Somebody, said Sergeant Pryder, would have something to talk of before the day was over. So there you are." "I suppose old Pryder didn't tell young Pryder any more than that," suggested Brent. "He did not, sir," said Peppermore. "Had he done so, Jimmy Pryder would have made half a column, big type, leaded out of it. No, nothing more. There are men in this world, Mr. Brent, as you have doubtless observed, who are given to throwing out mere hints, sort of men who always look at you as much as to say, 'Ah, I could tell you a lot if I would.' I guess Sergeant Pryder's one of 'em." "Whatever Sergeant Pryder knows, he's got from Hawthwaite, of course," remarked Brent. "To be sure, sir," agreed Peppermore. "Hawthwaite's been up to something. I've felt that for some days. I imagine there'll be new witnesses to morrow, but who they'll be I can't think." Brent could not think either, nor did he understand Hawthwaite's reserve. But he wasted no time in speculation. He had already made up his mind that unless something definite arose at the resumed inquiry, he would employ professional detective assistance and get to work on lines of his own. He had already seen enough of Hathelsborough ways and Hathelsborough folk to feel convinced that if this affair of his cousin's murder could be hushed up, it would be hushed up. The Simon Crood gang, he was persuaded, would move heaven and earth to smooth things over and consign the entire episode to oblivion. Against that process he meant to labour. In his opinion, the stirring up of strong public interest was the line to take, and he was fully determined that if the Coroner and his 12 good men and true could not sift the problem of this inquiry to the bottom, he would. That public feeling and curiosity, mainly curiosity, were still strong enough, and were lasting well over the proverbial 9 days, Brent saw as soon as he quitted the hall door of the Chancellor next morning. The open space between High Cross and the Moot Hall was packed with people, eager to enter the big court room as soon as the doors were thrown open. Conscious that he himself would get a seat whoever else did not, Brent remained standing on the steps of the hotel, lazily watching the gossiping crowd. And suddenly Mrs. Saumarez, once more attired in the semi-mourning which she had affected at the earlier proceedings, and attended by the same companion, came along the market-place in his direction. Brent went down and joined her. "Pretty stiff crowd," he remarked laconically. "I'm afraid you'll find it a bit of a crush this time. I suppose you'll not let that stop you, though?" He noticed then that Mrs. Saumarez was looking anxious, perhaps a little distressed, and certainly not too well pleased. She gave him a glance which began at himself and ended at a folded paper which she carried in her well-gloved hand. "I've got to go," she murmured. "Got to, whether I like it or not. They've served me with a summons as a witness. Ridiculous! What do I know about it? All that I do know is private." Brent stared at the bit of paper. He, too, was wondering what the Coroner wanted with Mrs. Saumarez. "I'm afraid they haven't much respect for privacy in these affairs," he remarked. "Odd, though, that if they want you now, they didn't want you at the first sitting." "Do you think they'll ask questions that are private?" she suggested half timidly. "Can't say," replied Brent. "You'd better be prepared for anything. You know best, after all, what they can ask you. I reckon the best thing in these affairs is just to answer plainly and be done with it." "There are certain things one doesn't want raking up," she murmured. "For instance, do you think you'll have to give evidence again?" "Maybe," said Brent. She gave him a meaning look and lowered her voice. "Well," she whispered, "if you have to, don't let anything come out about those letters. You know what I mean the letters you got for me from his rooms. I don't want it to be known, in the town, that he and I corresponded as much as all that. After all, there are some things." Just then, and while Brent was beginning to speculate on this suddenly revealed desire for secrecy, a movement in the crowd ahead of them showed that the doors of the Moot Hall had been thrown open. He, too, moved forward, drawing his companion with him. "You'll not forget that," said Mrs. Saumarez insistently. "Those letters, I mean, they're nothing to do with this, of course nothing. Don't let it out that—" "I shan't volunteer any evidence of any sort," responded Brent. "If I'm confronted with a direct question which necessitates a direct answer, that's another matter. But I don't think you've anything to worry about. I should say that what they want you for is to ask a question or two as to my cousin's movements that night. Didn't he call at your house on his way to the Mayor's Parlour? Yes, why, that'll be about it." "I hope so," said Mrs. Saumarez, with a sigh of relief. "But that witness box, and before all those people, I don't like it." "Got to be done," observed Brent. "Soon over, though. Now let's get in." He piloted Mrs. Saumarez and her companion into the Borough Court, handed over to the Coroner for the special purposes of his inquest, found them seats in a reserved part, and leaving them went over to the solicitors' table, where he took a place by the side of Tansley, already settled there with his notes and papers. Tansley gave him a significant glance, nodding his head sideways at other men near them. "Going to be a more serious affair, this, than the first was, Brent," he whispered. "These police chaps have either got something up their sleeves, or Hawthwaite's got some bee in his bonnet. Anyway, there's a barrister in this case on their behalf that little keen-eyed chap at the far end of the table on your left. That's Meeking, one of the sharpest criminal barristers going. And I hear they're meaning to call a lot of new witnesses. But what it's all about, I don't know." Brent looked up and down the table at which they were sitting. There were men there, legal-looking men, whom he had not seen at the opening day's proceedings. "Who are these other fellows?" he asked. "Oh, well, Crood's got a man representing his interests," replied Tansley, "and there's another solicitor watching the case on behalf of the Corporation. And I rather fancy that chap at the extreme end of the table is representing the Treasury, which may mean that this affair is going to be taken up at headquarters. But we know nothing till the cards are on the board. Hawthwaite looks important enough this morning to hold all the aces." Brent glanced at the superintendent, who was exchanging whispers with the Coroner's officer, and from him to the crowded seats that ran round three sides of the court. All the notabilities of Hathelsborough were there again in full force. Simon Crood in a seat of honour, as befitted his due dignity of mayor. Mallett, Coppinger, anybody and everybody of consequence. And there, too, was Krevin Crood and Queenie, and just behind Mrs. Saumarez, Dr. Wellesley, looking distinctly bored, and his assistant, Dr. Carstairs, a young Scotsman, and near them another medical man, Dr. Barber. And near the witness box were several men whom Brent knew by sight as townsmen, and who were obviously expecting to be called for testimony. He turned away, wondering what was to come out of all this. Once more the Coroner, precise and formal as ever, took his seat. Once more the 12 jurymen settled in their places, and while Brent was speculating on the first order of procedure, he was startled by the sharp official voice of the Coroner's officer. "Mrs. Anita Saumarez." Brent heard Tansley smother an exclamation of surprise. A murmur that was not smothered ran round the crowded benches behind him. There was something dramatic in the sudden calling of the pretty young widow, whose personality was still more or less of a mystery to Hathelsborough folk, and something curiosity raising in the mere fact that she was called. All eyes were on her as, showing traces of confusion and dislike, she made her way to the witness box. There was delay then. Mrs. Saumarez had to be instructed to lift her veil and remove her right hand glove. This gave the crowd abundant opportunity for observing that her usually bright complexion had paled, and that she was obviously ill at ease. It was with much embarrassment and in a very low voice that she replied to the preliminary questions. "Anita Saumarez, widow of the late Captain Roderick Francis Saumarez. Has been resident at the Abbey House, Hathelsborough, for about 2 years." "Doesn't like this job," whispered Tansley to Brent. "Queer! From what I've seen of her, I should have said she'd make a very good and self-possessed witness. But she's nervous. Old Seagrave'll have to tackle her gently." The Coroner evidently realised this as much as Tansley did. He leaned forward confidentially from his desk, toying with his spectacles, and regarded the witness with an encouraging and paternal smile. "Mrs. Saumarez," he began, "we want to ask you a few questions your replies to which may perhaps give us a little light on this very sad matter. I believe I am right in thinking that you and the late Mr. Wallingford were personal friends?" Mrs. Saumarez's answer came in low tones and in one word. "Yes." "Very close friends, I believe?" "Yes." "He used to visit at your house a great deal?" "Yes." "Dined with you, I think, once or twice a week?" "At one time, yes." You say at one time? When was that period, now?" Mrs. Saumarez, who up to this had kept her eyes on the ledge of the witness box, began to take courage. She lifted them towards the Coroner and, encountering his placidly benevolent gaze, let them remain there. "Well," she replied, "from about the time he became Mayor until the time of his death." "Regularly?" "Yes, regularly." "We may take it, then, that you were fond of each other's society?" Mrs. Saumarez hesitated. "He was a very interesting man," she said at last. "I liked to talk to him." The Coroner bent a little nearer. "Well, now, a more personal question," he said suavely. "You will see the importance of it. Mr. Wallingford was constantly visiting you. I want a plain answer to what I am going to ask you. Was he a suitor for your hand?" Mrs. Saumarez's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at the ungloved hand which rested, pressed on its gloved fellow, on the ledge before her. "He certainly asked me to marry him," she murmured. "When was that?" "Not long before his death." "And I'm afraid I must ask you what was your answer?" "I refused his offer." "Did that make any difference to your friendship?" "It hadn't done up to the time of his death." "He still visited you?" "Yes, just as often." The Coroner remained silent for a moment, glancing at his notes. When he looked towards the witness again he was blander than ever. "Now I shall have to ask you still more personal questions," he said. "It is, as you must be aware, Mrs. Saumarez, well known in the town that on your first coming here as a resident you became on terms of great friendship with Dr. Wellesley. Do you agree to that?" "Yes, I suppose so." "You used to go out a great deal with Dr. Wellesley, driving and so on?" "Yes." "In fact, Dr. Wellesley at that time paid you great attention?" "Yes." "Did those attentions cease about the time that you became so friendly with Mr. Wallingford?" "Well, they didn't altogether cease." "But shall we say fell off?" Mrs. Saumarez hesitated, obviously disliking the question. "I have always been friends with Dr. Wellesley," she said eventually. "All the same, has your friendship with him been quite what it was originally, since you became so very friendly with the late Mayor?" "Well, perhaps not." "Will you give me a plain answer to this question? Was there any jealousy aroused between Dr. Wellesley and Mr. Wallingford because of you?" This time Mrs. Saumarez took a long time to answer. She seemed to be thinking, reflecting, and when she replied it was only to question the Coroner. "Am I obliged to answer that?" she asked. "I am afraid I must press for an answer," said the Coroner. "It is important." "I think there was jealousy," she replied in a low voice. "On whose part?" "Dr. Wellesley thought I had thrown him over for Mr. Wallingford." "Had Dr. Wellesley ever asked you to marry him?" Mrs. Saumarez's answer came with unexpected swiftness. "Oh, yes, 2 or 3 times." "Had you refused him also, then?" Mrs. Saumarez paused. Her cheeks flushed a deeper red. "The fact was, I didn't want to marry anybody, just then, anyway," she answered. "They both asked me several times. If you please, will you not ask me any more about my private affairs? They've nothing to do with this. It wasn't my fault that those two were jealous of each other, and—" "She's let the cat out of the bag now," whispered Tansley to Brent. "Gad, I see how this thing's going to develop. Whew! Well, there she goes." For the Coroner had politely motioned Mrs. Saumarez away from the box, and the next instant the official voice rapped out another name. "Dr. Rutherford Carstairs." Chapter 11 of the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. The 19 minutes' interval. Carstairs, a red-haired, blue-eyed, stolid-faced young Scotsman, stepped into the witness box with the air of a man who was being forced against his will to the performance of some distasteful obligation. Everybody looked wonderingly at him. He was a comparative stranger in the town, and the unimaginative folk amongst the spectators were already cudgelling their brains for an explanation of his presence. But Brent, after a glance at Carstairs, transferred his attention to Carstairs' principal, at whom he had already looked once or twice during Mrs. Saumarez's brief occupancy of the witness box. Wellesley, sitting in a corner seat a little to the rear of the solicitors' table, had manifested some signs of surprise and annoyance while Mrs. Saumarez was being questioned. Now he showed blank wonder at hearing his assistant called. He looked from Carstairs to the Coroner, and from the Coroner to Hawthwaite, and suddenly, while Carstairs was taking an oath, he slipped from his seat, approached Cotman, a local solicitor who sat listening, close by Tansley, and began to talk to him in hurried undertones. Tansley nudged Brent's elbow. "Wellesley's tumbled to it," he whispered. "The police suspect him." "Good heavens!" muttered Brent, utterly unprepared for this suggestion. "You really think that?" "Dead sure!" asserted Tansley. "That's the theory. What's this red-headed chap called for else? You listen." Brent was listening keenly enough. The witness was giving an account of himself. Robert Carstairs, qualified medical practitioner, qualifications specified, at present assistant to Dr. Wellesley, been with him 3 months. "Dr. Carstairs," began the Coroner, "do you remember the evening on which the late Mayor, Mr. Wallingford, was found dead in the Mayor's Parlour?" "I do," replied Carstairs bluntly. "Where were you on that evening?" "In the surgery." "What are your surgery hours at Dr. Wellesley's?" 9 to 10 of a morning, 7 to 9 of an evening." "Was Dr. Wellesley with you in the surgery on that particular evening?" "He was, some of the time." "Not all the time?" "No." "What part of the time was he there with you?" "He was there with me from 7 o'clock until 7:30." "Attending to patients, I suppose?" "There were patients 3 or 4." "Do you remember who they were?" "Not particularly. Their names will be in the book." "Just ordinary callers?" "Just that." "You say Dr. Wellesley was there until 7:30. What happened then?" "He went out of the surgery." "Do you mean out of the house?" "I mean what I say out of the surgery." "Where is the surgery situated?" "At the back of the house, behind the dining room. There's a way into it from St. Lawrence Lane. That's the way the patients come in." "Did Dr. Wellesley go out that way, or did he go into the house?" "I don't know where he went. All I know is he went, leaving me there." "Didn't say where he was going?" "He didn't say anything." "Was he dressed for going out?" "No. He was wearing a white linen jacket such as we always wear at surgery hours." "And that was at 7:30?" "7:30 precisely." "How do you fix the time?" "There's a big, old fashioned clock in the surgery. Just as Dr. Wellesley went out, I heard the Moot Hall clock chime 7:30, and then the chimes of St. Hathelswide's Church. I noticed that our clock was a couple of minutes slow, and I put it right." "When did you next see Dr. Wellesley?" "At just 8:11. "Where?" "In the surgery." "He came back there?" "Yes." "How do you fix that precise time, 8:11? "Because he'd arranged to see a patient in Meadowgate at 8:10. I glanced at the clock as he came in, saw what time it was, and reminded him of the appointment." "Did he go to keep it?" "He did." "Was he still wearing the white linen jacket when he came back to you?" "Yes. He took it off, then put on his coat and hat, and went out again." "According to what you say, he was out of the surgery, wearing that white linen jacket, exactly 19 minutes. Did he say anything to you when he came back at 8:11 of where he had been or what he had been doing during the interval between 7:30 and 7:49? "He said nothing." "You concluded that he had been in the house?" "I concluded nothing. I never even thought about it. But I certainly shouldn't have thought that he would go out into the street in his surgery jacket." Well, Dr. Wellesley went out at 7:50 to see this patient at Meadowgate. Did anything unusual happen after that? In the surgery, I mean?" "Nothing, until a little after 8. Then a policeman came for Dr. Wellesley, saying that the Mayor had been found dead in his parlour, and that it looked like murder. I sent him to find Dr. Wellesley in Meadowgate, told him where he was." "You didn't go to the Moot Hall yourself?" "No, there were patients in the surgery." The Coroner paused in his questioning, glanced at his papers, and then nodded to the witness as an intimation that he had nothing further to ask him. And Carstairs was about to step down from the box when Cotman, the solicitor to whom Wellesley had been whispering, rose quickly from his seat and turned towards the Coroner. "Before this witness leaves the box, sir," he said, "I should like to ask him 2 or 3 questions. I am instructed by Dr. Wellesley to appear for him. Dr. Wellesley, since you resumed this inquest, sir, learns with surprise, and yes, I will say with disgust, for strong word though it is strictly applicable, that all unknown to him the police hold him suspect and are endeavouring to fasten the crime of murder on him. In fact, sir, I cannot sufficiently express my condemnation of the methods which have evidently been resorted to in underhand fashion." The Coroner waved a deprecating hand. "Yes, yes," he said. "But we are here, Mr. Cotman, to hold a full inquiry into the circumstances of the death of the late Mayor, and the police, or anybody else, as you know very well, are fully entitled to pursue any course they choose, in the effort to get at the truth. Just as you are entitled to ask any questions of any witness, to be sure. You wish to question the present witness." "I shall exercise my right to question this and any other witness, sir," replied Cotman. He turned to Carstairs, who had lingered in the witness box during the exchange between Coroner and solicitor. "Dr. Carstairs," he continued, "you say that after being away from his surgery for 19 minutes, on the evening of Mr. Wallingford's death, Dr. Wellesley came back to you there?" "Yes," answered Carstairs, "that's so." "Was anyone with you in the surgery when he returned?" "No, no one." "You were alone with him until he went out again to the appointment in Meadowgate?" "Yes, quite alone." "So you had abundant opportunity of observing him. Did he seem at all excited, flurried? Did you notice anything unusual in his manner?" "I didn't. He was just himself." "Quite calm and normal?" "Oh, quite." "Didn't give you the impression that he'd just been going through any particular moving or trying episode, such as murdering a fellow creature?" "He didn't," replied Carstairs, without the ghost of a smile. "He was just as usual." "When did you see him next, after he went out to keep the appointment at Meadow Gate?" "About 8:30, or a little later." "Where?" "At the mortuary. He sent for me. I went to the mortuary and found him there with Dr. Barber. They were making an examination of the dead man and wanted my help." "Was Dr. Wellesley excited or upset then?" "He was not. He seemed to me I'm speaking professionally, mind you remarkably cool." Cotman suddenly sat down and turned to his client with a smile on his lips. Evidently he made some cynical remark to Wellesley, for Wellesley smiled too. "Smart chap, Cotman," whispered Tansley to Brent. "That bit of cross-examin'll tell with the jury. And now, what next?" Bunning, recalled from the previous sitting, came next. Merely to repeat that the Mayor went up to his parlour at 25 minutes past 7, and that he and Mr. Brent found his Worship dead just after 8 o'clock. Following him came Dr. Barber, who testified that when he first saw Wallingford's dead body, just about 8:15, he came to the conclusion that death had taken place about 45 minutes previously, perhaps a little less. And from him Cotman drew evidence that Wellesley, in the examination at the mortuary, was normal, calm, collected, and, added Dr. Barber of his own will, greatly annoyed and horrified at the murder. Brent was beginning to get sick of this new development. To him it seemed idle and purposeless. He whispered as much to Tansley, but Tansley shook his head. "Can't say that," he replied. "Where was Wellesley during that 19 minutes' absence from the surgery? He'll have to explain that, anyway. But they'll have more evidence than what we've heard. Hullo! Here's Walkershaw, the borough surveyor. What are they going to get out of him, I wonder?" Brent watched an official looking person make his way to the witness box. He was armed with a quantity of rolls of drawing paper, and a clerk accompanied him whose duty, it presently appeared, was to act as a living easel and hold up these things, diagrams and outlines, while his principal explained them. Presently the eager audience found itself listening to what was neither more nor less than a lecture on the architecture of Hathelsborough Moot Hall and its immediately adjacent buildings, and then Brent began to see the drift of the borough surveyor's evidence. "The whole block of masonry between Copper Alley and Piper's Passage," testified Walkershaw, illustrating his observations by pointing to the large diagram held on high by his clerk, "was extremely ancient. In it there were three separate buildings separate, that was, in their use, but all joining on to each other. First, next to Copper Alley, which ran out of Meadowgate, came the big house long used as a bank. Then came the Moot Hall itself. Next, between the Moot Hall and Piper's Passage, which was a narrow entry between Rivergate and St. Lawrence Lane, stood Dr. Wellesley's house. And between it and the Moot Hall there was a definite means of communication, in short, a private door." There was a general pricking of ears upon this announcement, and Tansley indulged in a low whistle. He saw the significance of Walkershaw's statement. "Another link in the chain, Brent," he muttered. "'Pon my word, they're putting it together rather cleverly. 19 minutes' absence, door between his house and the Moot Hall. Come!" Brent made no comment. He was closely following the borough surveyor as that worthy pointed out on his plans and diagrams the means of communication between the Moot Hall and the old dwelling place at its side. In former days, said Walkershaw, some mayor of Hathelsborough had caused a door to be made in a certain small room in the house. That door opened on a passage in the Moot Hall which led to the corridor wherein the mayor's parlour was situated. It had no doubt been used by many occupants of the mayoral chain during their term of office. Of late, however, nobody seemed to have known of it, but he himself, having examined it, for the purposes of this inquiry, during the last day or two, had found that it showed unmistakable signs of recent usage. In fact, the lock and bolts had been quite recently oiled. The evidence of this witness came to a dramatic end in the shape of a question from the Coroner. "How long would it take, then, for any person to pass from Dr. Wellesley's house to the Mayor's Parlour in the Moot Hall?" "1 minute," replied Walkershaw promptly. "If anything, less." Cotman, who had been whispering with his client during the borough surveyor's evidence, asked no questions, and presently the interest of the court shifted to a little shrewd faced, self possessed woman, who tripped into the witness box and admitted cheerfully that she was Mrs. Marriner, proprietor of Mariner's Laundry, and that she washed for several of the best families in Hathelsborough. The fragment of handkerchief which had been found in the Mayor's Parlour was handed to her for inspection, and the Coroner asked her if she could say definitely if she knew whose it was. There was considerable doubt and scepticism in his voice as he put the question, but Mrs. Marriner showed herself the incarnation of sure and positive conviction. "Yes, sir," she answered. "It's Dr. Wellesley's." "You must wash a great many handkerchiefs at your laundry, Mrs. Marriner," observed the Coroner. "How can you be sure about that one?" "I'm sure enough about that one, sir, because it's one of a dozen that's gone through my hands many a time," asserted Mrs. Marriner. "There's nobody in the town, sir, leastways not amongst my customers, and I wash for all the very best people, sir, that has any handkerchiefs like them, except Dr. Wellesley. They're the finest French cambric. That there is a piece of one of the doctor's best handkerchiefs, sir, as sure as I'm in this here box, which I wish I wasn't." The Coroner asked nothing further. He was still plainly impatient about the handkerchief evidence, if not wholly sceptical, and he waved Mrs. Marriner away. But Cotman stopped her. I suppose, Mrs. Marriner, that mistakes are sometimes made when you and your assistants send home the clean clothes?" he suggested. "Things get in the wrong baskets, eh?" "Well, not often at my place, sir," replied Mrs. Marriner. "We're very particular." "Still, sometimes, you know." "Oh, I'll not say that they don't sometimes, sir," admitted Mrs. Marriner. "We're all of us human creatures, as you're very well aware, sir." "This particular handkerchief may have got into a wrong basket?" urged Cotman. "It's possible?" "Oh, it's possible, sir," said Mrs. Marriner. "Mistakes will happen, sir." Mrs. Marriner disappeared amongst the crowd and a new witness took her place. She too was a woman, and a young and pretty one, and in a tearful and nervous condition. Tansley glanced at her and turned, with a significant glance, to Brent. "Great Scott!" he whispered. "Wellesley's housemaid!" Chapter XII of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. Circumstantial evidence. Interest was beginning to thicken. The people in court, from Simon Crood, pompous and aloof in his new grandeur of chief magistrate, to Spizey the bellman, equally pompous in his ancient livery, were already open-mouthed with wonder at the new and startling development. But the sudden advent of the young and pretty domestic, whose tears betrayed her unwillingness to come forward, deepened the interest still further. Everybody leaned forward towards the centre of the court, intent on hearing what the girl had to tell. She, however, paid no attention to these manifestations of inquisitiveness. Standing in the witness box, a tear-soaked handkerchief in her hands, half sullen, half resentful of mouth and eye, she looked at nobody but the Coroner. Her whole expression was that of a defenceless animal, pinned in a corner and watchful of its captor. But this time it was not the Coroner who put questions to the witness. There had been some whispering between him, Hawthwaite and Meeking, the barrister who represented the police authorities, and it was Meeking who turned to the girl and began to get her information from her by means of bland, suavely expressed, half-suggesting interrogatories. "Winifred Wilson, 20 years of age, housemaid at Dr. Wellesley's, been in the doctor's employ about 14 months." "Did you give certain information to the police recently?" asked Meeking, going straight to his point as soon as these preliminaries were over. "Information bearing on the matter now being inquired into?" "Yes, sir," replied the witness in a low voice. "Was it relating to something that you saw in Dr. Wellesley's house on the evening on which Mr. Wallingford was found dead in the Mayor's Parlour?" "Yes, sir." "What was it that you saw?" The girl hesitated. Evidently on the verge of a fresh outburst of tears, she compressed her nether lip, looked fixedly at the ledge of the witness box. "Don't be afraid," said Meeking. "We only want the truth. Tell that, and you've nothing to be afraid of, nor to reproach yourself with. Now, what did you see?" The girl's answer came in a whisper. "I saw Dr. Wellesley." "You saw your master, Dr. Wellesley? Where did you see Dr. Wellesley?" "On the hall staircase, sir." "On the hall staircase? That, I suppose, is the main staircase of the house? Very well. Now, where were you?" "Up on the top landing, sir." "What were you doing there?" "I'd just come out of my room, sir. I'd been getting dressed to go out." "And how came you to see your master?" "I heard a door open on the landing below, sir, and I just looked over the banister to see who it was." "Who was it?" "Dr. Wellesley, sir." "Dr. Wellesley. What was he doing?" "He'd just come out of the drawing room door, sir." "Are you sure he'd come out of that particular door?" "Well, sir, I saw him close it behind him." "What happened then?" "He stood for a minute, sir, on the landing." "Doing anything?" "No, sir, just standing." "And what then?" "He went downstairs, sir." "And disappeared?" "He went towards the surgery, sir." "How was the staircase lighted when you saw all this?" "Well, sir, there was a light in the hall, at the foot of the staircase, and there was another on the drawing room landing." Then you could see Dr. Wellesley quite clearly?" "Yes, sir." "How was he dressed?" "He'd his surgery jacket on, sir, a white linen jacket." "You saw Dr. Wellesley quite clearly, wearing a white linen jacket, and coming out of the drawing room door. Now I want to ask you about the drawing room. Is there another room, a small room, opening out of Dr. Wellesley's drawing room?" "Yes, sir." "How big is it?" "Well, sir, it's a little room, not very big, sir." "What is it used for? What is there in it now?" "Nothing much, sir. Some bookcases and a desk and a chair or two." "Is there a door on its farther side, the side next to the Moot Hall?" "Yes, sir." "Have you ever seen it open?" "No, sir, never." "You don't know where it gives access to?" "No, sir." "Might be a cupboard, eh?" "I always thought it was a cupboard door, sir." "Very good. Now I want you to be very particular about answering my next question. What time was it when you saw Dr. Wellesley come out of his drawing room?" "It would be just about 7:45, sir." "Are you quite sure about that?" "Quite sure, sir." "Did anything fix the time on your mind?" "Yes, sir. At least I heard the clock strike the 6:15." "You're sure it was 7:45 that you heard?" "Yes, sir. Quite sure." "Why are you quite sure?" The witness reddened a little and looked shyly aside. "Well, sir, I'd got to meet somebody outside the house at 7:45," she murmured. "I see. Did you meet him?" "Yes, sir." "Punctually?" "I might have been a minute late, sir. The clocks had done striking." "Very good. And just before they began to strike you saw Dr. Wellesley come out of his drawing room door?" "Yes, sir." Meeking suddenly dropped back into his seat and began to shuffle his papers. The Coroner glanced at Cotman, and Cotman, with a cynical smile, got to his feet and confronted the witness. "Was it your young man that you went out to meet at 7:45 that evening?" he asked. "Yes, sir," admitted the girl. "What's his name?" "Joe Green, sir." "Did you tell Joe Green that you'd just seen Dr. Wellesley come out of his drawing room?" "No, sir." "Why not?" "Because I didn't think anything of it, sir." "You didn't think anything of it? And pray, when did you begin to think something of it?" "Well, sir, it was when the police began asking questions." "And of whom did they ask questions?" "Me and the other servants, sir." "Dr. Wellesley's servants?" "Yes, sir." "How many servants has Dr. Wellesley?" "4, sir, and a boy." "So the police came asking questions, did they? About Dr. Wellesley. What about him?" "Well, sir, it was about what we knew of Dr. Wellesley's movements on that evening, sir, where he was from 7:30 to 8:00. Then I remembered, sir." "And told the police?" "No, sir, not then. I said nothing to anybody at first." "But you did later on. Now, to whom?" The witness here began to show more signs of tearfulness. "Don't cry," said Cotman. "Whom did you first mention this to?" "Well, sir, it was to Mrs. Lane. I got so upset about it that I told her." "Who is Mrs. Lane?" "She's the lady that looks after the Girls' Friendly Society, sir." "Are you a member of that?" "Yes, sir." "So you went and told Mrs. Lane all about it?" "Yes, sir." "What did Mrs. Lane say?" "She said I must tell Mr. Hawthwaite, sir." "Did she take you to Mr. Hawthwaite?" "Yes, sir." "And you told him all that you have told us now?" "Yes, sir. Mrs. Lane said I must." "You didn't want to, eh?" Here the girl burst into tears, and Cotman turned to the Coroner. "I have no further questions to put to this witness, sir," he said, "but I would make a respectful suggestion to yourself. That is, that my client, Dr. Wellesley, should be called at once. We know now that the police have been secretly working up a case against Dr. Wellesley. In fact, I am very much surprised that, ignoring these proceedings altogether, they have not gone to the length of arresting him. Perhaps that's a card which Superintendent Hawthwaite still keeps up his sleeve. I may tell him, on behalf of my client, that he's quite welcome to arrest Dr. Wellesley and bring him before the magistrates whenever he likes. But as Dr. Wellesley's name has been very freely mentioned this morning, I think it will be only fair, sir, that he should be allowed to go into that box at once, where he will give evidence on oath." "If Dr. Wellesley elects to go into the box," interrupted the Coroner, "I shall, of course, warn him in the usual way, Mr. Cotman. He is not bound to give any evidence that might incriminate himself, but no doubt you have already made him aware of that." "Dr. Wellesley is very well aware of it, sir," replied Cotman. "I ask that he should be allowed to give evidence at once." "Let Dr. Wellesley be called, then," said the Coroner. "That, of course, perhaps, will be best." Brent inspected Wellesley closely as he stepped into the witness box. He was a well set up, handsome man, noted in the town for his correct and fashionable attire, and he made a distinguished figure as the centre point of these somewhat sordid surroundings. That he was indignant was very obvious. He answered the preliminary questions impatiently. There was impatience, too, in his manner as after taking the oath he turned to the Coroner. It seemed to Brent that Wellesley's notion was that the point-blank denial of a man of honour was enough to dispose of any charge. This time the Coroner went to work himself, quietly and confidentially. "Dr. Wellesley," he began, leaning over his desk, "I need not warn you in the way I mentioned just now. I'm sure you quite understand the position. Now, as you have been in court all the morning, you have heard the evidence that has already offered itself. As regards the evidence given by your assistant, Dr. Carstairs, as to your movements and absence from the surgery between 7:30 and 7:49, is that correct?" Wellesley drew himself to his full height and spoke with emphasis. "Absolutely." "And the evidence of the young woman, your housemaid, is she correct in what she told us?" "Quite." The Coroner looked down at his papers, his spectacled eyes wandering about them as if in search of something. Suddenly he looked up. "There's this matter of the handkerchief, or portion of a handkerchief," he said, "picked up, we are told, from the hearth in the Mayor's Parlour, where the rest of it had been burned. Did you hear Mrs. Marriner's evidence about that, Dr. Wellesley?" "I did." "Is what she said or suggested correct? Is the handkerchief yours?" "I have never seen the handkerchief, or, rather, the remains of it. I heard that some portion of a handkerchief, charred and blood-stained, was found on the hearth in the Mayor's Parlour, and that it had been handed over to Superintendent Hawthwaite, but I have not had it shown to me." The Coroner glanced at Hawthwaite, who since the opening of the court had sat near Meeking, occasionally exchanging whispered remarks. "Let Dr. Wellesley see that fragment," he said. All eyes were fixed on the witness as he took the piece of charred and faintly stained stuff in his hands and examined it. Everybody knew that the stain was from the blood of the murdered man. The same thought was in everybody's mind. Was that stain now being critically inspected by the actual murderer? Wellesley suddenly looked up, at the same time he handed back the fragment to the policeman who had passed it to him. "To the best of my belief," he said, turning to the Coroner, "that is certainly part of a handkerchief of mine. The handkerchief is one of a dozen which I bought in Paris about a year ago." A murmur ran round the crowded court at this candid avowal. As it died away, the Coroner again spoke. "Had you missed this handkerchief?" "I had not. I have a drawer in my dressing room full of handkerchiefs, several dozens of them. But, from the texture, I am positive that that is mine." "Very well," said the Coroner. "Now, about the evidence of Mr. Walkershaw. Did you know of the door between your house and the Moot Hall?" "Yes. So did the late Mayor. As a matter of fact, he and I, some time ago, had it put to rights. We both used it. I to go into the Moot Hall, he to come and see me." "There was no secrecy about it, then?" "Not between Wallingford and myself, at any rate." The Coroner took off his spectacles and leaned back in his chair, sure sign that he had done. And Meeking rose, cool and level voice. "Dr. Wellesley, I think you heard the evidence of Mrs. Saumarez?" But before Dr. Wellesley could make answer, the other doctors present in the court room were suddenly called into action. As the barrister pronounced her name, Mrs. Saumarez collapsed in her seat, fainting. CHAPTER XIII